Ah yes, the Amazon jungle, a place filled with the evidence of hidden civilizations, but yet turns the explorers trying to find them into walking skeletons who are forced to eat horsehide and shoe leather to survive, while being welcomed with a barrage of poison-tipped arrows being flung from somewhere within the trees. An environment so bred for hostility that it puts humans almost at the bottom of the food chain, especially the first explorers. So between the 1500s and 1800s, the first explorers who set out into the Amazon to look for evidence of hidden civilizations were met with a 90% mortality rate. This was probably one of the deadliest jobs to ever exist, and in fact, it was 3 times deadlier than fighting in the battles during the Napoleonic era. We are talking about an expedition that was more deadly than the warfare 200 years after the expedition took place. Could you imagine being asked to go on an expedition that is 3 times deadlier than warfare 200 years from now? That's just something I couldn't even imagine. I don't even know what expedition could possibly be that deadly. So anyway, in today's video, we're going to be talking about one of the most overlooked, iconic, and important explorers during all of the exploration period. An expedition that set the stage of Amazonian exploration for the next 300 years. So even though the legends and the lore of El Dorado are set somewhere deep within the wilderness of South America, the idea of looking for ancient civilizations that contain an abundant amount of resources and especially gold can actually trace its roots back to pre-Columbian Mexico. In 1519, Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez arrived on the shores of Mexico, and even though the Spanish crown had forbid him from taking his army and invading the mainland, he thought, well, the king is about 5,000 miles away, and the sands of the shores of Mexico are already under my feet and between my toes. So, you know, may as well just conquer this whole continent. And that's exactly what he did. With about 500 men each being weighed down with their equipment and giant balls, they descended upon the Aztec Empire with a little bit of courage, a little bit of luck, and a lot of disease. And I mean a lot of it. So much disease, in fact, that the markets of the Aztec town square of Tenochtitlan were actually stacked with the rotting, stinking corpses of over 60,000 indigenous people. Cortez and his men toppled the Aztec Empire, founded the city of New Spain, and gave the Spanish crown an enormous foothold into the Americas. But what excited the conquistadors the most was the evidence of gold, an abundance of gold. They smelted all of it down, every single artifact, every piece of jewelry, every piece of clothing, every gold ornament that they could find. They smelted all of it down and shipped it all back to Spain. And in fact, to this day, the largest cache of Mesoamerican gold that has ever been found does not actually come from the Aztec world, because more than 99% of it is completely gone today. The largest cache actually came from a Zapotec tomb that existed some 2,000 years before the Aztecs ever even arose in Mesoamerica. But the gold didn't all come from Mexico, and in fact, most of it didn't. Cortez's men actually traced the gold west of Tenochtitlan out towards the Mexican coast, and it turned out the Aztecs actually had far-flung trade routes going all the way down to South America. So, where do you think the Spanish were headed next? By 1532, the Spanish had hijacked and followed these Aztec trade routes, landing on the northern coast of Peru, and immediately they knew they landed within the territory of an empire who was far larger, far more powerful, and far richer than the Aztec Empire, if the Spaniards could even believe it. The amount of gold that the Inca Empire had compared to the Aztecs, well, it's not comparable. The gardens of the Inca capital, Cusco, were made of gold. I mean, every bush, tree, flower, and every individual leaf on all of them was fashioned out of gold. By 1533, the Spaniards had conquered the Inca Empire, seized their gold, smelted it all down, re-established Cusco as a Spanish city, and Francisco Pizarro, as well as his men, attained legendary fame, status, and incredible amounts of wealth. Following the conquest of the Inca Empire, the Spanish conquistadors were steeped in the lore of great civilizations hidden further in the interior of this newly found continent that we know today as South America. The most famous of these legends was known as El Dorado. Eventually, El Dorado would come to represent a city of gold, but originally it referred to the Gilded One or the Golden One. It was this Amazonian king somewhere in the interior of the Amazon who was said to have covered himself in this golden dust, and he would sail out on a boat and then dive into this lake. This was some kind of religious rite, giving piety to the gods and sacrificing this gold to the gods. A lost or hidden civilization somewhere deep within the interior of South America that had a king who was covering himself in gold and just dumping it all into a lake? This sounded too good to be true, but it wasn't too good to be true. The Spanish had already conquered the Aztec Empire, filthy rich with gold. They had just conquered the Inca Empire, even more filthy rich with gold. This was not something that the Spanish did not believe. They absolutely believed that El Dorado the king or El Dorado the city did exist somewhere in the interior of the continent. The idea that there was a great king out there who covered himself in gold and washed it off in a lake seemed like the beginning of another legendary conquest. Now, in the modern day, I find that some scholars seem to downplay the possibility of lost, hidden, golden civilizations hidden somewhere deep in the Amazon. They play this off as a conquistador or colonial trope that was used to justify the colonization of the Americas. But I don't think that that is true whatsoever. In reality, this actually downplays the magnificence of the Native American world. Tenochtitlan in Mexico and Cusco in Peru were both described by Spaniards who had also seen many of the great ancient cities of the Mediterranean as being the most spectacular, grand, and well-planned cities they'd ever seen, going so far as to say and wonder if all the things that they had experienced in the Americas were just a dream or some kind of mirage. So when they heard of vast cities of gold hidden deep in the jungles of South America, or stories of great kings covering themselves in gold dust, this wasn't news to them. They had already seen these things taking place in both Mexico and in Peru. So Francisco Pizarro, the main conqueror of the Inca Empire, was now part of an extremely influential and wealthy family. So naturally, he gave powers to members of his family, including his brother. Enter Gonzalo Pizarro. Gonzalo was a conquistador and was the younger half-brother of Francisco. He joined his brother in the conquest of the Inca in 1530 and proved himself as a bold and ruthless soldier. He watched his brother ascend to the highest levels of fame and fortune and wanted to achieve similar feats for himself. He wanted the fame, he wanted the fortune, he wanted the honor, and perhaps more importantly to Gonzalo, he was jealous of his brother. Throughout the 1530s, Gonzalo, as well as really any other Spaniard worth their salt and had some kind of lust for adventure and finding riches, had heard the stories of El Dorado. Great untouched civilizations, gold, and even a land of cinnamon somewhere in a faraway place. And while we wouldn't compare the value of cinnamon to gold in the modern day, you have to remember that this was just the beginning of the establishment of the world economies. And all around the world, people were lusting after cinnamon. It was actually just as valuable, in some ways more valuable than gold. So by 1540, Francisco had appointed Gonzalo as the governor of a city called Quito. At the time, Quito was a city on the northern edge of the Inca Empire, but today it's the capital of Ecuador. And it was from here that Gonzalo would set out to launch his own expedition to find this legendary land of cinnamon. But obviously, he wouldn't be doing this alone. So he recruited about 340 soldiers, most of which had fought alongside him during the Inca War and were ready to conquer another mystical land filled with riches. And the greatest decision Gonzalo Pizarro ever made was in picking his right-hand man. He needed a young, charismatic, brave, and fearless leader to accompany him and help lead the men. And ironically though, the greatest decision that Gonzalo Pizarro ever made is also exactly the reason that very, very few people remember Gonzalo's name today. Enter Francisco de Orellana. Thought to be a distant cousin of the Pizarros, Francisco de Orellana was just about 10 years old when the Aztec Empire was crushed in 1541. He was 16 years old when he sailed from Spain to the New World, and he was 21 when he fought in the Inca conquest from 1532 to 1536. He was tasked with suppressing the Inca uprisings in Cusco, and by 1540 he was 29 years old and was now a battle-hardened and trusted lieutenant who'd even lost an eye during the Inca Wars, and was appointed governor of Guayaquil, a small but strategically important Spanish port south of Quito on the modern-day coast of Ecuador. And while this may have really sounded like a sweet gig for the 29-year-old conquistador, Guayaquil was actually a backwater with hardly any more than about 50 Spanish conquistadors occupying the city who were constantly under threat of native attack, people popping out of the jungle with axolotls, spears, bows, clubs, and poison-tipped arrows. So really, this was not that great of a gig. But we have have to remember, we're talking about just a few thousand conquistadors living 5,000 miles away from home on the opposite side of the planet, trying to conquer an entirely new continent. So in some way, I guess it's pretty cool. Still though, while Francisco de Orellana perhaps had some honor, he still lacked the fame and especially the wealth of the Pizarros. But he was young, he was ambitious, and he was searching for any opportunity to take part or lead his own great conquest. Partly due to his military reputation and partly due to the familial connection to the Pizarros, but probably more so due to the fact that Francisco de Orellana expressed so much interest in joining Gonzalo Pizarro on his expedition to find the land of cinnamon that he even told Gonzalo that he would bring his own men and fund all of their expedition and the equipment, at least for his party. Gonzalo chose Francisco de Orellana to be the lieutenant of his next great expedition. The agreement was that Pizarro would head off to cross the Andes in the 1st Regiment, and Orellana, leading his own men, would follow Pizarro's path and rendezvous in the Sumaco Valley on the other side of the mountains. So while Pizarro made his final preparations in Quito, Orellana returned to Guayaquil to recruit the men, get the supplies, food, and weapons before heading back to Quito and embarking upon what has been called the most laborious and dangerous expedition that has ever been taken in the Americas. Just before Gonzalo Pizarro took off, he learned that a rival explorer, Gonzalo Diaz Pineda, who had just returned to town after a failed expedition to find the Cinnamon Spice Valley somewhere off in the Amazon on the other side of the Andes, was back in town and was about to head out for another expedition. Not wanting to deal with the exploratory competition, Pizarro commandeered Pineda's efforts and brought Pineda along on his expedition to serve as a guide. So heading off into the Andean mountains, Pizarro, Pineda, and a force of 220 Spanish soldiers, 200 armed horses carrying ammunition and gunpowder, a herd of 3,000 pigs for consumption, 2,000 war dogs that were trained not just for herding the pigs, but for battle, literally intended to tear the Native Americans limb from limb. Not to mention the 4,000 native porters who were chained and shackled and were expected to bear the brunt of the expedition's haul unless they could break away or escape somehow in the middle of the night. So in the late of February in 1541, Gonzalo Pizarro, Pineda, and the rest of the expedition were on their way to hopefully discover this lost Cinnamon Spice Valley as well as a great hidden civilization. As they marched through the terrible terrain of the Andes, the environment quickly began taking its toll upon the men. The expedition fluctuated between 9,000 and 14,000 feet. It was this part of the mountain range that the territory of the Inca Empire ended, and the paved Inca roads that the horses enjoyed began fading into Amazonia, a region of South America so dense and full of warrior tribes that even the great Inca could not conquer it. Yet, here these Spaniards were set out to explore these uncharted lands, not even knowing the terrain beyond where Pineda had been before, which wasn't very far. The expedition was beginning to receive barrages of arrows flung from small warrior troops hiding in the terrain, but when the natives saw the heavily armored men and four-legged armored beasts, they retreated away into the bush. It wasn't long after this that the expedition was literally shaken by an earthquake, and even though earthquakes were common in the Andes, it was always a bad omen, a sign of things to come. Volcanic eruptions began, the sky became charged with electricity as thunder and lightning ripped through the sky. The Spaniards darted for shelter in the abandoned native villages, but the rumbling of the ground toppled most of the ancient structures and left them with no protection from the elements. The Andes were hard on all of the men, but especially the natives. Half naked, marching through frigid heights and falling dead left and right from hypothermia, they had only traveled about 30 miles from Quito, and over 100 of the natives had perished from the environment alone, and only a few were lucky to escape at night. It took about 2 months to reach the other side of the Andes before the men began descending down into warmer weather, but with every step further into Amazonia, the environment only became more inhospitable. Pizarro later wrote, "We came to a very rugged, wooded country and great mountain ranges through which we were obliged to open up new roads, not only for the men but for the horses. It just rained. It never stopped raining long enough to dry the shirts on our backs." So for any of you who haven't spent a significant amount of time in the jungle or a thick wooded bush, anything similar to the Amazon, when you're out there, the trees are extremely large and they bloom up above you like a large canopy that blocks out all the sunlight. I've been gone in the jungles of the Maya world, such as Mexico, Guatemala, and I've been out there for weeks, and when I come home, people ask me, "Hey, didn't you just go on a trip down to Mexico or Guatemala? You look like you haven't even been outside." Well, I was out in the jungle where there is no sunlight. So when it's raining and that rain is ripping down through the tree leaves and constantly dripping on you, there is no possible way to dry off if the rain doesn't stop. Even Gaspar de Carvajal, one of the men who we'll discuss later, wrote about his experience dealing with bugs in the Amazon. We were so plagued by mosquitoes and other vermin that we could neither sleep nor eat in peace, for they swarmed in clouds, biting and stinging us without cease. As the rain came relentlessly pouring down, the streams filled with water, and the crew was forced to resort to agonizingly assemble and reassemble impromptu bridges for each and every man, native, horse, dog, pig, and heavy wooden crate to cross, one by one. And after 3 months of doing this, the expedition had finally agonizingly reached the Samaco Valley. This was a lush, relaxed region in the eastern foothills of the Andes on the western edge of Amazonia, where Pizarro writes, "We continued our journey till we reached the province of Samaco, a good 110 miles away from Quito, and within which it was reported there was a big population, but it was impossible to travel there on horseback, and there I halted the expeditionary force in order to get it rested, both the Spaniards and the horses, for all were quite worn out in consequence of the great hardships which they had gone through in climbing up and going down the great mountains, and because of the many bridges which had to be built for the crossing of the rivers." And it was just about this time that Orellana had just returned to Quito to begin his expedition with his own troop of Spaniards. As they prepared to depart, members of Quito's wealthier class pulled Orellana to the side and urged him not to embark on such a long and dangerous journey with so few men, horses, and supplies. But Orellana is the main character of this story, and he had given Pizarro his word, after all, that he would meet him in the Samaco Valley as soon as possible. So yet again, just like Hernan Cortez more than 2 decades earlier, a small detachment of Spanish explorers carrying nothing but an insufficient amount of equipment and their giant balls descended off into an uncharted land on the opposite side of the planet, in search of glory and a better life than they'd ever known before. After crossing the foothills of the Andes, reaching the base of the mountains and beginning their ascent, Orellana found that the warnings he'd received in Quito were well warranted. The natives were much less intimidated by his small band of adventurers, and throughout his long journey, retracing the path of Pizarro's force, Orellana was relentlessly welcomed with barrages of arrows, killing some of his men and killing or losing every single horse that they'd come with in the chaos. They were eventually able to navigate their way through cut paths and ravaged villages and rickety bridges left behind by Pizarro's force, and the few native inhabitants that still remained were picking up the pieces of their lives from the chaos in the wake of the Spanish. Eventually, Orellana and his merry band of adventurers stumbled into Pizarro's camp half naked and starved. According to Gaspar de Carvajal, Orellana arrived not as a fresh reinforcement that the rest of the expedition had hoped he would, but a stripped bare soldier carrying nothing but a sword and the willingness to endure the road ahead. Now sitting at the opening of the Great Samaco Valley, Pizarro headed off with a small group where he discovered a village and encountered a powerful and knowledgeable chieftain named Delacola. Through broken translation, he asked Delacola in a less than polite way if there were any civilizations or other settlements around that were more rich than the one that he was currently standing in. Delacola essentially responded by saying yes, but they're further off, much farther off to the east. He also told Pizarro through broken translation that he had actually been to these places. He also told Pizarro that his own territory stretched quite a long distance until they would reach the territory of a rival tribe, and then beyond that territory was an even more dangerous tribe, but there were great and large cities out there to be seen. Now, no one knows for sure if Delacola was telling the 100% truth to Pizarro as he was being interrogated, as Delacola was undoubtedly aware of the Spaniards' interrogation tactics in the past, such as torturing and murdering Native Americans to get information out of them. A lot of scholars think that in situations like this, Native American chieftains would have just lied to the Spaniards or told them what they were wanting to hear, essentially saying, "Oh yeah, further down there, further down here, far away from us. Go down that way and you'll find what you're looking for," and knowing full well that these are even more dangerous lands that they're sending the Spanish off into, and hoping that the Spanish will go down, probably be killed or starved to death, and leave the chieftain and his people alone. And it is possible that Delacola may have been telling Pizarro not the full truth, and that Delacola may very well have been hiding his own form of El Dorado that the Spanish to this day have never discovered. That is very likely. But Delacola would not be so lucky as to send the Spanish on a wild goose chase and leave he and his people alone. No, as suspicious as he was of Pizarro, Pizarro was equally suspicious of him. And Pizarro said, "Oh, you've seen these great cities. You're a powerful man. You've actually been there. I think you can show me these places, actually. You're going to come with me." So Della Cola was nicely kidnapped and forced to join along on the expedition. It was also about this time that Gonzalo Pizarro realized that trying to explore the Amazon on foot or on horseback was a death sentence. He looked at the way the Amazonians navigated, and they used a main highway system, the river. They did not try, to a great extent, to traverse the land on foot. Yes, there were trails off in the backcountry, but these were small trails where he was at. By far, most of these Amazonians, all of them, when they needed to travel a medium to great distance, they traveled by the water. And he realized this was the key to exploring Amazonia. If there was a great civilization off somewhere in the interior of the Amazon, it was going to be along the riverside, just like all of the villages he had seen before were. So within a few months, Pizarro, Pineda, Chief Della Cola, and Orellana had formed an armada and were sailing down the Coca River, headed for the Napo River, which would lead them deeper into the Amazon. But things were bad, really bad. At this point, over 3,000 of the native porters had already died from the harsh elements and the weight that they were expected to bear. 1/5 of the Spaniards had also died, and at this point, men were falling out every hour of every day. Most of the horses were dead, most of the dogs were dead or had run off into the jungle, and all of the pigs they had brought with them to eat were dead too. It was now Christmas Day of 1541, and the men were forced to boil the leather of their shoes and of the horse's saddle to eat as a Christmas meal. Things were pretty bleak. And it was here that Pizarro's leadership was beginning to fall into question, and without any more resources or food, everyone was beginning to wonder if going forward was anything more than a death mission. So Pizarro appointed Orellana along with 57 men and a few rickety canoes to scout a little further down the Coca River, while Pizarro hung back with a larger party until they returned, estimated about 10 to 12 days later, hopefully with some good news of settlements and large farms and food ahead. Over the next 12 days, Orellana and his merry band of adventurers would do their best to navigate down the now rushing and raging waters of the Napo River. This river was much more intense than the slow, meandering currents they'd experienced before. And when time was coming for the expedition to turn around and head back to Pizarro, all of the men, including Orellana, knew that this just wasn't possible. It wasn't possible to sail back up this rapid current that the Spaniards had never seen before in the Amazon. And they had learned before that it was impossible to travel the distance that they had gone 12 days downstream, back upstream, back towards Pizarro's camp. The men were just a hair away from mutiny if Orellana didn't give in and comply with their wish to continue downstream in hopes to find some kind of settlement. So Orellana had to draft a letter to the King of Spain, essentially to cover his ass, because he was going to have to answer for all of this, if he survived. In this letter, he wrote down why it was physically impossible to return to his commanding officer, Pizarro, and that absolutely none of his men were willing to make the journey back. He also had each of the men sign it, essentially each of them saving each other's ass. And now, early in January of 1542, Francisco de Orellana had ascended to the level of the main character and was now the head of his own expedition going down the Amazon at 30 years old. Now, that's Orellana, who he is, and why he ended up in the Amazon. But the point of the First Explorer series is not to give you a play-by-play historical account of these first explorers all around the world, but to tell you what they actually find according to the first-hand accounts. But to give you a background of why the far-reaching edges of the world were explored, who the explorers were, and what they found according to their own words, according to the first historical accounts. So, what did they find? As Gonzalo Pizarro returned to Ecuador in defeat and was forced to do nothing but write letters complaining about his former companion to the King of Spain, Orellana was just now beginning his long journey across the Amazon River. Just as the Spaniards had been told back at the Coca River, for the next 250 miles until they reached the mouth of the Great Amazon River, signs of habitation and food were sparse. Nothing seemed to live in this vast stretch of river. And after 48 days of this, they finally reached the Amazon River, where signs and sites of civilization began to spring out in front of them. Vast, endless, gleaming cities with huge fleets of canoes appeared on the river's horizon. Before we came within 2 leagues of the city, we saw many buildings that shone white along the riverbank, and they were so large that they stretched for more than 20 leagues, which is 60 modern miles, with houses very close together. And we found them a great quantity of food such as maize, manioc, fish, and turtles. And the Indians attacked us with many canoes, some with 30 or 50 men, armed with bows and clubs and spears. We also saw wide paved roads leading inland, which showed it to be a very populous and rich province. As hordes of Amazonians sailing through the river waged an endless battle on the Spaniards, Orellana was forced to cease fighting from the boats and land upon this great city. As they came close to the shore, Spaniards leaped from the boats and their razor-sharp Spanish steel blades cut through the air. The Amazons disappeared into the forest and further off into the city. Orellana sent a handful of men to run off the rest of the natives, while he and the other men ransacked the houses looking for food and tended to their wounds. When the men returned, they told Orellana that the city simply didn't end, it just went on and on. They told him that it was enormous, impressively organized, and stocked with food. There was a great quantity of food, such as turtles in pens, biscuits made from maize, and a great deal of fish, and even pools of water. Now, this is likely either referring to reservoirs, but it may also be referring to something else. These Amazonians may have also had literal swimming pools. This isn't something that's crazy. These existed in the Aztec capital city of Tenochtitlan. They also exist in the Maya capital city of Palenque, where you can go out into the ruins and you can find ancient swimming pools that are about the size of modern private home swimming pools that are still being filled with fresh, crystal clear blue water today. Could this have been something that the Spaniards had found in this Amazonian city? And something else I think about is if they had even found a luxury private swimming pool in an Amazonian city, would they have even understood the concept of a swimming pool? Certainly baths existed in the Mediterranean world, but I'm not sure about swimming pools. And all this in such great abundance that there was enough to feed an expeditionary force of 1,000 men for a year. The Spaniards found that these people, who they would later come to know as the Machu, were incredibly sophisticated with large sprawling farms raising manioc, beans, yams, peppers, pineapples, avocados, sweet potatoes, peanuts, and they even raised large hives of honeybees. They hunted manatees, dried their meat for preservation, and used their hides for shield covers. The Spaniards even talk about how the manatee meat was some of the most nutritious and energizing food they'd ever eaten. They found turtle farms containing thousands of different specimens with the intention of being eaten. And as they began gathering food to store in the boats before fleeing down the river, large Amazonian warriors with painted bodies and flattened foreheads and elongated skulls began appearing from somewhere within the city. The Spaniards had not seen anything like this in their encounters with the Amazonians, and maybe only a few of them had seen elongated skulls like this from the Peruvian world. And this, along with the fear of the death from starvation, were one of the only things that actually struck fear into the Spaniards. After 2 hours of fighting, the Spaniards successfully retreated back to their boats with a surprising amount of food, but at the cost of 1/3 of the entire armada being grievously wounded with spears and arrows piercing their arms and legs, one young Spaniard even dying from his injuries days later. Over the next 7 months, from February to August of 1542, Orellana and his men survived an innumerable onslaught of attacks from Amazonian warriors, but they saw all of the evidence of golden cities and hidden civilizations that they'd come to find. Over the course of their more than 2,000-mile journey, Orellana likely visited or saw somewhere around 200 settlements, from the size of small villages to huge cities ranging up to 60 miles long. And of course, they were attacked along the entire journey. There went about among these men in the war canoes 4 or 5 sorcerers, all daubed with whitewash and their mouths full of ashes which they blew into the air, having in their hands a pair of aspergills, an instrument for sprinkling holy water, which they moved along and kept throwing water about the river as a form of enchantment. And after they had made one complete turn about our boats, they called out to the warriors, and at once these began to blow their wooden bugles and trumpets and beat their drums, and with a very loud yell they attacked us. And they were even attacked by something that I in particular find very interesting: warrior shamans. To perform assaultive sorcery, the master awakens the effigy by fumigating it with tobacco smoke and makes it stand and sway on the palm of his cupped hand. Suddenly, the figurine lifts off with the roar of a hurricane and flies to the targeted village, whose residents can hear the missile approaching but not see it. This is honestly one of the craziest first-hand accounts that I found from the Amazonian world. I have absolutely no idea what Carvajal is talking about here, but they definitely saw it. Only the local white shaman beholds the flying image and warns the people of the dying days that lie ahead. When in the air, the quartz pebbles surge in a triangular formation closely followed by the figurine. Hovering over the village, the intrusive foursome selects its victims, swoops down, and kills the enemies one by one in quick succession. The pebbles tear into their bodies like an arrowhead, allowing the effigy to penetrate deeply into its victims. The siege may last for 4 days, until many have succumbed as if to an attack by a war party. So Carvajal is talking about hearing and seeing accounts from the native Amazonians of sorcerers attacking other villages and leaving the people injured, wounded, and killed as though they had been attacked by a war party. This is fascinating, and I honestly don't know what to make of this. I just think that there are so many things about the Native American world that the Western and European mind just can't comprehend, and things that used to exist in pre-Columbian times that we are completely disconnected from in the modern world. Probably the only people who have or hold on to any kind of inkling of this ancient knowledge are the uncontacted tribes living in Amazonia today. Another one of the most interesting discoveries that the Spaniards made was a place that they came upon that they called Pottery Town. It was filled with vast storage houses of perfectly made, painted, and polished pieces that were more elegant than even the finest works that the Spaniards had seen from Greek and Roman antiquity. And you have to remember that many of the Spaniards who were on these expeditions and conquest were very well educated and very wealthy people even back home in Spain. And you have to remember that Spain was also colonized by Greek and Roman cities. So these Spaniards were very familiar with the great pieces from Roman and Greek antiquity. Other small pieces such as plates and bowls and candelabra of this porcelain of the best that has ever been seen in the world. For that of Malaga is not its equal, because this porcelain for which we found is all glazed and embellished with all colors and so bright that they astonish. And more than this, the drawings and paintings which they make in them are so accurately worked that one wonders how with only natural skill they manufacture and decorate all these things like Roman articles. Unfortunately, none of these exact pieces that Oriana saw are known to us today. But judging by other specimens of ancient Amazonian pottery, I can almost definitely say that they were actually on par with Roman, Greek, and even Minoan pottery. Even the location of this pottery town is unknown, although it is thought to have been somewhere near where the Japara River meets the Amazon River. And I went and looked at this in satellite imagery as I was curious, and from what I can tell, it certainly looks like it would have been a hotspot area where 3 different rivers intersect. Perfect for a town that specializes in creating, storing, and selling pottery throughout the surrounding regions of Amazonia that likely had even greater populations somewhere on the interior, which is exactly the impression that Francisco de Orellana got as well. So if you're looking for an ancient lost city hidden somewhere within the jungles of the Amazon, I think that where these 3 rivers meet is probably a good place to start. And what I've loved about this project is that for so many of these things, if you're trying to look for an ancient lost civilization, you really have to get deep into the historical first accounts and the sources to actually find little glimmers of what could potentially be a hidden civilization. So the expedition would go long stretches of time before seeing any signs of civilization. But when civilization did arrive upon the river's horizon, it was overwhelmingly evident that sophisticated and industrious civilizations existed all throughout the Amazon. The land was very fertile, and we saw great fields of maize and manioc and other crops unknown to us, with channels of water brought from the rivers to them, and the fields were raised above the floodwaters, which was a marvel to behold. And nearly 500 years later, we now understand and know the reason why Orellana would, when he was traveling down the Amazon through the rivers, he would only find certain pockets of civilization. And this was because the Amazonians cultivated man-made gardens using a black soil called terra preta, which makes even the most infertile soil a rich garden ripe for cultivation of any crops one could desire. They came across a large series of towns across a 5-mile stretch. They were friendly people ruled over by an overlord named named Paguana, who had many subjects and quite civilized ones. They also learned that Paguana did not reside in this riverside town, but instead lived somewhere at a further inland capital city that possessed great quantities of silver and large herds of llamas, and that the land there was very pleasing and attractive and very plentifully supplied with all kinds of food and fruit such as pineapples and pears and custard apples and many other kinds of fruit of very good quality. But after suffering a nearly fatal beating in the last land assault, Oriana simply charted the location of this village and was determined to continue on down the Amazon. Perhaps they would return here someday, better armed and better prepared for a conquest. After all, Francisco was only 31 years old. The following days, traveling down Paguana's region, they noted as many as 20 individual towns along the riverbank. At the end of the day, they saw a town that stood out as peculiar. They called this place the end of the province of Overlord Paguana. From there, we saw indications of the existence of savannas, for the huts were roofed over with straw of the kind that grows in savannas, and it was believed that they must bring it here from the inland country, toward which went out many roads which undoubtedly led to the other cities situated away from the river in the interior of the country. Throughout the next month, Oriana and his men never ceased to spot small villages, towns, and even large cities along the river. Some peaceful, others warlike. They eventually came upon another large city with sights unlike anything they'd seen before. As they approached, the city dwellers showed themselves to be peaceful and talkative, and they invited the Spaniards to come in through the gates and walk around the city square. At this gate were two towers, very tall and having windows, and each tower had a door, two facing each other, and at each door were two columns, and this entire structure rested upon two very fierce lions, which we can probably safely assume are actually pumas or jaguars, which turned their glances backwards as though suspicious of each other, holding between their forepaws and claws the entire structure, in the middle of which there was a hole through which they offered and poured out chicha for the sun, for this was the wine which they drank, and the sun is whom they worship and consider their god. And struggling to understand what the purpose and the meaning behind this monument was, Oriana, using some of his linguistic skill and through rough but broken translation, managed to get some kind of meaning for this place. They were subjects and tributaries of the Amazon, and that the only service which they had rendered them consisted in supplying them with plumes of parrots and macaws for the lining of the roofs of buildings which constitute their places of worship, and that all the villages which they had were of that kind, and that they had that carved tree there as a reminder, and that they worshipped it as a thing which was the emblem of their mistress, who is the one who rules over all of the land of the aforesaid women. Nearby this monument, they also found a large temple, and inside they found feathered robes and costumes. They were told that the Amazonians would adorn these costumes during religious rites and festivals in front of their idols. And to Oriana, this seemed all too similar to the legends of the Aztec rituals, rites, and festivals that were performed at Tenochtitlan just a couple decades earlier. And of course, the Aztecs were no strangers to sacrificing their own people as well as the Spaniards. The Amazonians didn't harm the Spaniards, but they quickly left this town and saw more towns with very similar monuments as they continued downriver. Now, every settlement they passed had their banks lined with Amazons clutching their spears in organized rows ready for an assault should the Spaniards attempt to make landfall. As days and days went on like this, the Spanish were eventually forced to raid a small village. To get the rest of the inhabitants to flee from the village, Oriana set fire to the houses, and among the smoldering ruins found a young girl who was talkative and clearly very intelligent. They took her back to the boats after collecting all the food that they could and sat down to try to get information out of her, this time not torturing her. And after spending some time learning to converse with each other, Oriana got something very interesting out of her. She said that nearby in the interior were many Christians like ourselves, and that they were ruled by a chief who had brought them upriver, and that two of them had Christian wives and the others had married Indians who had borne them children. She told us that these were people who had been lost out of Diego Ordaz's party, or so we thought from her indications regarding them, for she pointed to the north. Now, this makes complete sense. People don't actually realize this, but from North America into Mesoamerica and Central America, modern-day Mexico, and all across South America, there were very early Spanish and European parties who would poke around and attempt to explore unofficially the interior of the American continents, and they would go missing only to be rediscovered decades later by other Europeans exploring the Americas, And when they tried to interact with each other, the Europeans who had gone missing before had forgotten their native tongue of Spanish, and they were now speaking a fully indigenous language and fully inducted into the indigenous life with absolutely no willing to return to the European world, which should give you some kind of indication as to how good life must have been in the pre-Columbian world. Later that summer, Orellana also captured a young trumpeter from his settlement following a peculiar skirmish with the natives, where tall, light-colored women emerged from the ranks with their hair braided down to their waist. They stood and slit the throats of any Amazonian warrior who attempted to retreat the battle. And when it came time to fight, these women were so fierce that one warrior even cut down 3 Spaniards. And immediately this reminded Orellana of the great Greek legends of the Amazon warriors. And in fact, it should be added that even Columbus had seen female warriors in the Caribbean, and Cortez had seen female warriors on an island off of Panama. So after another short period of figuring out how exactly to communicate with each other, this young trumpeter told Orellana about who he was and where he had come from and the people of his village. The Indian answered that they lived in the interior 7 days' journey away, and since Cuenco was subject to them, they had come to guard the shore. The captain asked if they were married, and the Indian said no. The captain asked how they lived, and the Indian answered in the interior, and that he had been there many times and had seen their customs and way of life since he had been sent there by his chief to carry the tribute. The captain asked if they were numerous, and the Indian answered yes, and that he knew 70 of their villages by name, named them before those of us who were present, and said that he had been to several of them. The captain then asked if their houses were made of straw, and the Indian answered no, that they were built of stone and had proper doors, and that the roads ran between these villages that were walled on both sides, and that they had guards at intervals along them to collect dues from those who used them. Another version describes these walls as paneled with silver all around them for half a man's height from the floor, and against them were placed silver seats, which they used for their worship and their drunken feasts. There is addition too of a temple ceiling lined with variegated feathers of parrots and macaws. The captain asked if their villages were large, and the Indian answered that they were. He asked if they bore children, and the Indian answered yes. The captain asked how they became pregnant since they were not married and no men lived in their villages. He said that at certain times they felt desire for men and assembled a large army with which they went to make war on a neighboring chief and brought his warriors by force to their villages, where they kept them for as long as they wanted. Then when they were pregnant, they sent their prisoners back unharmed. If when their time came they bore a male, they killed him or sent him to his father. If they are girls, they rear them carefully and train them to war. He said their queen was called Kanori, and that they had great quantities of gold and silver, and that the principal women are served on gold and silver late and have gold and silver vessels, while the common women use earthenware, otherwise wood. He said that in the principal city where the queen lived, there were 5 very large buildings used as temples and sacred to the sun. He added that they call these temples Karanane, and that they contain gold and silver idols in female shape, and that from 3 feet above the floor these temples are lined with heavy wooden panelings painted in various colors. He said that they have many gold and silver vessels used in the divine service, and that women are clothed in very fine wool, for in that land there are many llamas like those of Peru. Their clothing is a blanket worn either girded across the breast or thrown around the neck, or secured at the front with a pair of cords like a cloak. They wear their hair down to the ground and golden crowns on their heads as wide as 2 fingers. The Indian informed us further that no man is permitted to remain in the women's villages after sunset, but must depart for home at that time, and that many provinces bordering on these women's lands are subject to them and pay tribute and services to them. But with others they remain at war, and particularly with that tribe from which they seize men that are to get them with child. He added that these women are light-skinned and of very great stature and numerous. Word was clearly spreading throughout the Amazon that a very dangerous fleet of foreigners was headed downriver, and many of the settlements they passed were inhabited by warriors who threw spears and flung arrows at the armada, usually not causing too much damage to the Spanish steel armor, but some Amazonian weapons are too stealthy and too small to avoid. One day, following a small skirmish, one of the Spaniards, Garcia de Soria, was withering around in agony on the boat deck. A poison dart had struck him in the thigh between his armor, and he'd only noticed after the fighting had calmed down. Dipped in the venom of a poisoned dart frog, it had only barely pierced his skin. But for the next 24 hours, he withered in unspeakable pain, began convulsing and seizing on the deck floor before leading to paralysis, where he then died. Almost every settlement they passed now had newly built fortresses at the shoreline. The Amazons knew they were coming and had had plenty of time to prepare. It wasn't safe anymore to try to raid a larger village, and eventually they came upon what looked like one of the open savannas that they'd seen months earlier. The men desperately needed to stretch their legs and sleep on dry ground. They found a safe place to rest for a few days, and Oriana sent out a recon troop to explore the nearby area. The men found old fishing and hunting trails that were undoubtedly ancient, leading to a burned-down village that must have been the result of an inland native conflict. Beyond this savanna land, the Spaniards realized that they were finally reaching the ocean. Coastal winds were sweeping through the river valley, and the land became thick and dense and marshy. They found islands they thought that they could make safe landfall on, only to discover that they were actually floating vegetation along the river's course. We struck out among islands that are really a part of the river's course, that are too numerous to count and in some cases very large, navigating among which calls for highly skilled mariners and pilots to be able to decide where to go and where to come out, because the islands make the river divide up into so many arms. However, some of these islands actually were made up of real land. Oriana decided to make landfall upon one of these islands that contained a seemingly abandoned village, only to find human flesh roasted on barbecues ready to be eaten. Arms, legs, hands, feet. Oriana didn't quite find anything appetizing enough to eat that day. Further down the river, they came across another village with an even more exciting surprise. They found Amazonians who had clearly interacted with other Europeans at some point in the past. Here at this village, they found elegant pottery crafted with the designs of Spanish ships. They were immediately noticeable, and there was no question. These were Spanish ships painted onto clay vessels deep within the Amazon. And they could only be one thing. 42 years earlier, in the year 1500, Vicente Pinzon had actually been the first Spaniard to discover the mouth of the Amazon. Although he didn't make landfall and he never interacted with the natives, clearly the natives hiding somewhere off in the shadows of the jungle had seen him, and his presence, this otherworldly sight sitting in the mouth of the Amazon, had made quite an impression on them. And now, here Francisco de Orellana was, 42 years later, traveling from the opposite side of the Amazon, had discovered these clay vessels made by people who had seen Vicente Pinzon 42 years earlier. A thing well worth seeing are the pictures which all the Indians along this river put on the vessels, which they had used for their household service, both clay and wooden ones, and on the gourds out of which they drink, because of the exquisite and beautiful leaves and the carefully drawn figures, and in the excellent skill and organization that is required in making them. They apply colors to them and make them stay on very well, and these colors are very good and very fine, each one being of a special kind and a different shade. They manufacture and fashion large pieces out of clay, with relief designs in the style of Roman workmanship. And so it was that we saw many vessels such as bowls and cups and other containers for drinking in jars as tall as a man. Very beautiful and made out of very fine quality of clay. Ultimately, of the 220 Spaniards and 4,000 native porters that set out on this long Amazonian expedition nearly a year earlier, only 38 Spaniards lived to see the mouth of the Amazon on August 26, 1542. So that was Oriana's first expedition down the Amazon, and everything that he saw according to the first-hand accounts. Ultimately, those 38 Spaniards did survive. They shipwrecked on an island, they built another boat, they sailed to the islands off the coast of Venezuela, and eventually sailed back to Spain, where Oriana pleaded his case that he was unable to return to Pizarro and requested the funds for a second Amazonian expedition, of which we may have to get to in a future video of the first explorers. But because of the fact that Francisco de Orellana was not as famous originally as people like the Pizarros or Hernan Cortez or Columbus, he is somewhat overlooked. I mean, for those of you that are interested in the Amazon, surely you have heard the name Francisco de Orellana. But he was a legendary explorer, a legendary young man that inspired generations of Amazonian explorers all the way up to the expeditions of Percy Fawcett in the early 1900s. And nearing the 1800s, it began being viewed by more aristocratic scholars that from people like Francisco de Orellana, the Amazonian explorers that followed him, and including Percy Fawcett, that they were all lying about the sights and sounds that they had seen, the evidence of these hidden, great, wealthy, sophisticated, advanced civilizations hidden somewhere in the interior of South America. They began to brush these things off as all just kind of colonial tropes, myth, legends, lores. They forgot the first-hand historical accounts of all of the gold that was found in Tenochtitlan, all of the gold that was found in the Inca Empire. Not just that, but the Moche Empire and so many other cultures in South America. They forgot all of these things and they kind of fell to the wayside. The idea that El Dorado, a lost city somewhere out there in the Amazon, could be real. They forgot that this was never something that was just a fable to the Spaniards, and it wasn't a fable to the Amazonians either. These places actually existed. And thanks to modern day LiDAR, we are actually finding ample amounts of evidence of these sites, at least on the peripheral of the Amazon, as exploring the central of the Amazon really just hasn't been done. So that's the first episode of The First Explorers. I'm Luke Caverns. Thank you so much for joining me, and like and subscribe for more if you'd like more stories of exploration on the edges of the world. So I know I've said it before, but there really is nothing quite like Machu Picchu. I don't believe that I have ever stood in an ancient site around the world that was as evocative and as breathtaking as this lost city that sits perched atop a ridge deep within the Andean Amazon. We don't know the name of this city, we don't know exactly when it was built, and we don't know what it was used for. We've only known the city exists for just over 100 years, and it's still a mystery to us. And it was definitely a mystery to the first explorers. My name's Luke Caverns, I'm an American explorer, and I come from a lineage of explorers who searched the American Southwest for lost Spanish gold and ancient artifacts dating all the way back to the 1890s, and this is the first explorers. Machu Picchu is a lost city that was never supposed to be found. When the city was abandoned, its name was never spoken again. Conquistadors exploring the Peruvian realm never found the city or heard an utterance of its name or location. It was found in one of the farthest reaches of the Inca Empire, in one of the most inaccessible regions of South America, upon one of the most perilous ranges in the Andes, in one of the most dangerous jungles in the world. And yet, it's perhaps the most spectacular and awe-inspiring ancient site in the entire world, not just for its unmatched scenery, but the precision and engineering of the city itself. Stone masonry that rivals and even surpasses ancient Egypt while hanging off of sheer cliffs at 8,000-foot elevation. And as much as I've seen people discuss Machu Picchu and the amazing things that can be seen there, I've never actually seen someone dive in and investigate the word-for-word accounts of what was found at Machu Picchu by its first explorers. So in today's video, we're going to do just that. By the mid-1500s, the Inca Empire had completely collapsed. The Inca emperor had been killed, the capital city of Cusco had fallen into Spanish control, and the conquistadors were spreading across South America in search of other great native civilizations to discover and, of course, conquer. Over the next 400 years, Europeans would sweep across North, Central, and South America, discovering, plundering, and sometimes destroying all signs of the world that existed here before their arrival. The mound builders of North America, the sprawling metropolis of the Maya world in Mexico and Central America, the citadels of the Inca realm, and many more lost cities and civilizations had been discovered over the centuries and all but destroyed. But still, a great lost city had not yet been found in the Amazon. Oriana saw them and heard rumors of even larger cities hidden deep in the interior, but when future Europeans returned, the Amazon was a vast, empty jungle, almost as if everything Oriana had seen were really ghosts. Now, none of the cities he saw along the riverbanks existed. They'd all been reclaimed by the jungle. By the early 1900s, tales of great lost cities like El Dorado still persisted, but they were mostly brushed off as conquistador myths created to justify further exploration. Few people still believe that there were actually great discoveries still to be made in the Americas. That was, except for a 33-year-old American teacher named Hiram Bingham. Bingham wasn't an archaeologist. He taught South American Latin history at Yale. He was the only professor on this subject, and hardly anyone signed up for his classes. Enrollment was typically in the single digits, and the class was seen as an oddity or a filler course. But it's in these obscure and relatively unpopular spaces that the glimmers of unsolved mysteries can really be found. Bingham was familiar with the story of how the conquistadors conquered the Inca Empire and installed their own puppet emperor named Manco Inca, but eventually Manco turned on the Spaniards and led a native rebellion that was unsuccessful in reclaiming Cusco, so he and more than 50,000 Incas fled deep into the farthest reaches of the fallen empire to a city called Vilcabamba. Manco Inca fled with more than 50,000 Indians of war and service, taking all the people he could and went into the Andes, where he fortified himself in very rough land. Eventually, the Spanish found the city and burned it to the ground, leaving nothing but the stone buildings remaining and giving the ruined city back to the mountainous jungles to reclaim. From here on, Europeans lost the location of Vilcabamba and it became a lost city. This mystery fascinated Hiram Bingham and really grabbed onto him after visiting Peru for the first time in 1908. He spent that trip riding on muleback, gazing off into the Andean mountain range, wondering across which ridgetop might he find the famous lost Inca capital. And by the time he returned home, he was already planning his expedition to find the lost city. Over the course of the next 3 years, Bingham would spend his time begging affluent Yale alumni in New York City and Boston to donate to his expedition, but almost nobody was interested or even believed that there was some ancient lost city to be found. Finally, though, a small organization called National Geographic granted him a $5,000 donation toward the expedition expenses, and finally, the journey was made possible. In the early summer of 1911, Hiram Bingham returned to Peru with a small expedition crew. They started in Cusco and over the course of a couple of days had passed through Urubamba and Ollantaytambo and were headed deeper into the region where the Andes Mountains met the Amazon, creating some of the most fierce environments known to man. Steep cliffsides that loom over the winding rivers being pelted by rain at least every other day. If the Inca had retreated to their farthest corners to build a city they hoped the Spanish would never find, this seemed like the place. The expedition was made up of only 8 people: Hiram Bingham, his good friend and colleague Harry Ward Foote, a naturalist and botanist, plus 5 other colleagues, including a physician, a geologist, 2 topographers, and an additional naturalist, as well as a local police officer named Sergeant Delphin Carrasco, who Bingham had hired to accompany them. Hiram Bingham's goal was to travel ahead of the group with Carrasco, navigating down the riverside through the winding valleys, visiting small Inca communities, and asking locals if any of them knew of ruins hidden among the mountains. Meanwhile, the majority of the expedition would lag behind with the supplies, collecting plant and animal specimen, and other research. Halfway through the second day, the rain came showering down into the valley. The men were freezing, sopping wet, and very hungry. They came across a small settlement owned by a kind Peruvian man named Melchor Artiega. Melchor invited them inside, dried them off, and fed them a stew of potatoes. During their conversation, Melchor mentioned that he knew of a set of ruins up on the mountaintop nearby, but that visiting it was impossible right now because of the rain, and that the local landowners didn't exactly want anybody going up there. When Artiega learned that we were interested in the architectural remains of the Incas and we were looking for the palace of the last Inca, he said there were some very good ruins in this vicinity. In fact, some excellent ones on top of the opposite mountain called Huayna Picchu, and also on a ridge called Machu Picchu. After some convincing, Bingham was able to get the man to agree to take them to the top of the mountain to see the ruins once the rain stopped. When I asked just where the ruins were, he pointed straight up to the top of the mountain. No one supposed that they would be particularly interesting, and no one cared to go with me. Our naturalist said there were more butterflies near the river, and he was reasonably certain that he could collect some new varieties. Our surgeon said that he had to wash his clothes and mend them. Anyhow, it was my job to investigate all reports of ruins and to try to find the lost Inca capital. As they set out for the ruins, they walked past the body of a viper that had just been killed. It was here that Bingham learned of the local lancehead viper known to us today as the fer-de-lance, and that it was a particularly dangerous snake that was very common in this area. In these warm regions, the deadly fer-de-lance abounds. The Indians call it the Nahaka or the ergon. A single bite means death in a few hours unless one is lucky enough to have anti-venom serum at hand. We were constantly warned to watch our step, particularly at night, for the fer-de-lance loves to lie across the narrow trails. The fertile ants is clearly regarded by Bingham as the single most deadly obstacle of exploring the lower valleys of the Inca realm, more deadly than the altitude, terrain, weather, or even starving. This snake is, by far, the animal mentioned most often by Bingham in all of his published books on exploring Peru. Over the next hour, they began walking along the dirt road, which connected the rural settlements along the valley, but was likely originally an Inca trail serving the same purpose. Eventually, though, they turned off the trail and descended into the bush just above where they could hear the river rushing below. They came to a bridge made of thin tree trunks that were lashed together by vines. Bingham watched as Carrasco and Melchor took off their shoes and walked easily across the bridge with a kind of natural ability that they clearly inherited from the ancients. But looking down into the icy river and jagged stones, Bingham crawled on his knees inch by inch across the bridge. Leaving the stream, we now struggled up the bank through dense jungle and in a few minutes reached the bottom of a very precipitous slope. For an hour and 20 minutes, we had a hard climb. A good part of the distance, we went on all fours, sometimes holding on by our fingernails. Here and there, a primitive ladder made from the roughly notched trunk of a small tree was placed in such a way as to help one over what might otherwise have proved to be an impassable cliff. In another place, the slope was covered with slippery grass where it was hard to find either handholds or footholds. Crawling on all fours up the cliffside, it was here that Melchor began groaning about and worrying about snakes. He'd seen those lance heads in areas like this before. The heat and the humidity were excessive, and the three men were essentially completely exhausted by noon with only the water they had on them, as the river was now some 2,000 feet below. Shortly after noon, just as we were completely exhausted, we reached a little grass-covered hut 2,000 feet above the river where several good-natured Indians, pleasantly surprised at our unexpected arrival, welcomed us with dripping gourds full of cool, delicious water. Then they set before us a few cooked sweet potatoes. It seemed that two Indian farmers, Ricarte and Alvarez, had recently chosen this eagle's nest for their home. They said that they had found plenty of terraces here on which to grow their crops. Laughingly, they admitted they enjoyed being free from undesirable visitors, officials looking for army volunteers, or collecting taxes. Although the valley had probably been unoccupied for centuries, the government was likely pushing descendants of the Inca back further into the far corners of Peru. And at some point, someone had stumbled across these ancient Inca terraces hanging thousands of feet in the air. They were built with such care that they'd not fallen into ruin since the area was abandoned centuries ago, and the soil was still fertile, lying unused, ready to grow crops. So, the modern Inca, driven back by a foreign government, had taken up home in the hallowed and forgotten grounds of their ancestors in one of the most inaccessible regions of Peru. Up here, they were growing corn, sweet potatoes, white potatoes, sugarcane, beans, peppers, and gooseberries. The natives told them that they were only two ways out of this place. One, the precarious cliff they just barely climbed up, and an equally dangerous path leading down the mountain that can only be taken safely about once a month on a dry day. Now, Bingham was a little uncertain that anything greater than these farming terraces and the few huts they'd seen was actually awaiting them at the top of the mountain, which was still several thousand feet in elevation away, and he was so tired from the heat and humidity that he wasn't exactly in a rush to leave this tranquil little Inca home he had stumbled upon. Accordingly, I was not unduly excited nor in a great hurry to move. The heat was still great, the water from the Indian spring was cool and delicious, and the rustic wooden bench hospitality covered immediately after my arrival with a soft woolen poncho, most comfortable. Furthermore, the view was simply enchanting. Tremendous green precipices fell away to the white rapids of the Urubamba below. Immediately in front of the north side of the valley was a great granite cliff rising 2,000 feet sheer. To the left was the solitary peak of Huayna Picchu, surrounded by seemingly inaccessible precipices. On all sides were rocky cliffs, and beyond them, cloud-capped, snow-covered mountains rose thousands of feet above us. Even just from this low spot, Hiram Bingham could tell that this was an absolutely stunningly gorgeous setting for even the smallest, most insignificant Inca village to have been built. The natives weren't interested in taking Bingham to the top of the mountain and much preferred to stay down in the village and chat with Melchor, whom they'd met once before some time ago. So instead, they sent a young boy to guide Bingham and Sergeant Carrasco to the top of the mountain. Hardly had we left the hut and rounded the promontory, then we were confronted with an unexpected sight, a great flight of beautifully constructed stone-faced terraces, perhaps 100 of them, each hundreds of feet long and 10 feet high. They had been recently rescued from the jungle by the Indians. A veritable forest of large trees, which had been growing on them for centuries, had been chopped down and partly burned to make a clearing for the agricultural processes. The task was too great for the two Indians, so the tree trunk had been allowed to lie as they fell, and only the smaller branches were removed. But the ancient soil carefully put in place by the Incas was still capable of producing rich crops of maize and potatoes. However, there was nothing to be excited about. Similar flights of well-made terraces are to be seen in the upper Urubamba Valley at Pisac and Ollantaytambo, so we patiently followed the little guide along one of the widest terraces where there had been a small conduit and made our way into an untouched forest beyond. And it was here, just beyond this point, that not only Hiram Bingham's life would change forever, but the way that we view ancient Peru as a whole would be completely changed forever. Now, that's Hiram Bingham, how he ended up in the mountainous jungles of Peru, and why he became the leader of the expedition that would one day find Machu Picchu. But the point of the first explorers is not to give you a complete retelling of the history, but to give you a background of why the edges of the world were explored, who the explorers were, and what they found. So, what did he find? Suddenly, I found myself confronted with the walls of ruined houses built of the finest quality of Inca stonework. It was hard to see them, for they were partly covered with trees and moss, the growth of centuries, but in the dense shadow, hiding in bamboo thickets and tangled vines, appeared here and there walls of white granite ashlars carefully cut and exquisitely fit together. We scrambled along through dense undergrowth, climbing over terrace walls and in bamboo thickets, where our guide found it easier going than I did. Suddenly, without any warning, under a huge overhanging ledge, the boy showed me a cave beautifully lined with the finest cut stone. It had evidently been a royal mausoleum. On top of this particular ledge was a semicircular building whose outer wall, gently sloping and slightly curved, bore a striking resemblance to the famous Temple of the Sun in Cusco. This might also be a Temple of the Sun. It followed the natural curvature of the rock and was keyed to it by one of the finest examples of stone masonry I had ever seen. Bingham had just discovered the carved out and modified caves hidden beneath the temples of this ancient palace, believing they must have been royal burials, perhaps where the mummies were placed. He'd read about and seen Inca burial sites for royal figures in finely worked caves and crypts carved into the mountainsides around Cusco and other places around the Andes. And just above these crypts, he made a discovery that truly left him in awe. He came across megalithic, precisely cut white granite ruins sitting perched atop Machu Picchu, the name of the mountain. The temple he was standing at is still known today as the Sun Temple. The stones were hewn together with such precision that not even a hair plucked from your head could fit between the blocks, and the weight of the stone was so great that even centuries upon centuries of abandonment and overgrowth, the jungle could not dislocate the temple blocks. After pulling back the vines, the walls sat there without moving even a centimeter from the spot they'd been placed when this great city was built. And he says that this was the finest stonework he'd ever seen. Owing to the absence of mortar, there were no ugly spaces between the rocks. They might have grown together on account of the beauty of the white granite. This structure surpassed in attractiveness the best Inca walls in Cusco, which had caused visitors to marvel for 4 centuries. It seemed like an unbelievable dream. Dimly, I began to realize that this wall and its adjoining semicircular temple over the cave were just as fine as the finest stonework in the world. The boy was urging Bingham to move along. They came across a finely cut granite staircase leading just past a small garden the natives had planted and into a courtyard surrounded by 3 megalithic cyclopean temples. Suddenly, we found ourselves standing in front of the ruins of 2 of the finest and most interesting structures in ancient America. Made of beautiful white granite, the walls contained blocks of cyclopean size, higher than a man. The sight held me spellbound. Each building had only 3 walls and was entirely on one side. The principal temple had walls 12 feet high which were lined with exquisitely made niches. The building did not look as though it ever had a roof. The top course of beautifully smooth ashlars was left uncovered so that the sun could be welcomed here by priests and mummies. I could scarcely believe my senses as I examined the larger blocks in the lower course and estimated that they must weigh from 10 to 15 tons each. Would anyone believe what I had found? Fortunately, in this land where accuracy in reporting what one has seen is not a prevailing characteristic of travelers, I had a camera and the sun was shining. Now, today, what Hiram Bingham had found is known as the main temple of Machu Picchu. Its walls are several feet thick, and nearly half of one of the structure's 3 walls are entirely made of a single stone. The construction of the city is far more elegant and impressive than anything seen in Cusco, of which the walls in Cusco have puzzled travelers and scholars for 500 years now. Also, the ancient stonework at Machu Picchu, at least on a 1-to-1 scale, outmatches the vast majority of stone masonry in Egypt, at least tying with Egypt's best stone masonry. It appears as though Machu Picchu was intentionally designed as if it were emerging from the earth itself, as if at any moment the lines between the blocks could disappear and the temples would become part of the mountain again. So here is another perfect example of how the Inca architecture just evolves from these natural granite outcroppings to essentially stone blocks like this. Like, they're making the granite outcroppings look like they are stone blocks. See right here? Perhaps this is evoking a sense that the earth itself had gifted this place to the Inca. No one knows for sure. Nowhere else in Peru, as far as I know, is there a similar structure conspicuous for being a masonry wall with 3 windows. It will be remembered that Salcamaywa, the Peruvian who wrote an account of the antiquities of Peru in 1620, said that the first Inca, Manco the Great, ordered works to be executed at the place of his birth consisting of masonry wall with 3 windows. Was that what I had found? If it was, then this is not only the lost capital of the last Inca, but the birthplace of the first. It did not occur to me at that time that it might be both. So here Hiram Bingham was, at only 35 years old, 2 days into his Peruvian expedition that he'd been planning for the last 3 years and 6 months, hardly able to convince anyone of a great lost city hidden somewhere in the Peruvian wilderness, now standing in the center of a massive, uncharted city that sat atop a ridge of an 8,000-foot elevation that may not only be the lost capital he was searching for, but could also be the birthplace of the first Inca emperor, Manco the Great. It was obvious that the city was of some great importance, but whether it was the birthplace of the first Inca or the final capital of the Inca would take further exploration, mapping, and investigation. They started out by clearing and mapping the ruins. The intense environment and thick undergrowth made clearing very difficult, but after 3 weeks, it was finally cleared enough to be easily walked and drawn out. Everyone was amazed at the size, scale, and grandeur of the city. There was no doubt that this was an important place sometime long ago. By 1912, they organized the operation of Yale University, working in conjunction with National Geographic and the Peruvian government to thoroughly explore the ruins. Their first obstacle was opening a path up the precarious mountainsides that didn't risk everyone's lives in the same way Bingham had risked his to find this place. A single crate carrying enough supplies to last 2 men for 8 days weighed some 60 pounds. That same crate would weigh much more when it was loaded with pottery sherds and artifacts on its way back down. Eventually, they found a passable area to cross the river thousands of feet down in the canyon below. They built an ingenious but painstakingly difficult bridge to construct and cleared their first large path up the mountainside. During the clearing of the jungle, they encountered many different snakes, including bushmasters and, of course, fertilances. Ultimately, nobody was ever bitten or seriously injured, but a few native porters and members of the exploration team did take some tumbles down the mountainside, usually ending with nothing more than a friendly laugh from those around them. Once the road was finished, in-depth exploration and excavation was underway. As Bingham was preoccupied with the main site, he inquired with his friend Mr. Held about finally exploring the top of the opposite cliff that Melchior had told them about weeks ago, supposedly also containing hidden ruins. Mr. Held took the challenge, and although it took him a week of cutting through the thick bush with a machete and crawling on his stomach through different animal trails, he finally climbed his way up to the top of Huayna Picchu. There were no ancient buildings the size of what they'd seen down at Machu Picchu, but there were amazingly precariously crafted stone staircases that seemed to lead straight into the sky. I've actually climbed up these staircases, and it is very precarious. It is so easy to lose your sense of up and down, left and right, as the staircase seems to somehow disappear into the sky, and just to your left is an 8,000-foot sheer drop-off. At the very top, though, there was a cave with a small camp. Bingham and his team interpreted this to be an ancient lookout or fire signal that overlooked and guarded the main city, which of course all the more added to the mystique and obvious importance of the city. They continuously had to clear the ruins of vegetation so often that over the course of 4 months, they needed to clear the entire city 3 times. Over the course of the following years, Bingham and his greatly expanded team explored the ridges of the surrounding mountains across the valley and determined that this was, in fact, the largest settlement by far in the immediate region. Hiram Bingham believed he had found the lost last capital of the Inca Empire, Vilcabamba. The sanctuary was lost for centuries because this ridge is in the most inaccessible corner of the most inaccessible section of the Central Andes. No part of the highlands of Peru is better defended by natural bulwarks. A stupendous canyon whose rock is granite and whose precipices are frequently 1,000 feet sheer, presenting difficulties which daunt the most ambitious modern mountain climbers. Yet, here in a remote part of the canyon, on this narrow ridge flanked by tremendous precipices, a highly civilized people, artistic, inventive, well-organized, and capable of sustained endeavor at some time in the distant past, built themselves a sanctuary for the worship of the sun. So after multiple seasons of exploring Machu Picchu and combing over its layout, it was undeniably obvious to Bingham why the city had not been found by any other explorer. It is naturally fortified, with one of its 3 entrances being a narrow, razor-edge footpath just a few feet wide sitting atop a 1,500-foot cliff. Its natural fortifications made it the finest candidate Bingham had ever seen for the lost city of Vilcabamba, the last Inca capital. Furthermore, Bingham also finds evidence of the city being built in multiple phases at the megalithic front gate of the city. The city gate shows evidence of being repaired. The top of the narrow ridge is at this point occupied by a large granite boulder, which was worked into the fortifications, or rather the walls were strengthened by its being used as a member. As a result, the outer gatepost of the massive entrance rests as an artificial terrace. This terrace has settled a few inches owing to erosion in the steep hillside. Consequently, the wall has been thrown out of the perpendicular and has started to destroy the fine old gateway. It will not be long before the great lintel will fall and carry with it the repaired part of the wall, which is superimposed above it. One clearly gets the feeling in looking at the entrance to the citadel that it was rather hastily repaired at a period long subsequent to its original construction. This initial observation plays further into the idea that Machu Picchu was not just a late period site during Spanish conquest, but was a city that had existed long before the Spanish arrived, perhaps going back into the earliest periods of the Inca, or perhaps even predating the Inca. At the very least, this was a city that had been built over many lifetimes. Bingham also notes the presence of no symbolic staircases. This is a common motif found carved into the rocks in sites around Cusco or Tiwanaku and other sites around Bolivia and Peru. The symbolic staircases that seem to lead to nowhere and serve no physical purpose. But here at Machu Picchu, Bingham found none of these symbolic staircases. Every staircase here seemed to serve a practical function. He wondered if the motif of staircases was not younger than the city he'd found. Again, perhaps some kind of evidence that Machu Picchu was much older than one might think. The stairway or flight of steps as an ornamental or ceremonial motif in Inca architecture does not seem to occur here, although it might well have originated in this locality. In the ruins of a monolithic gateway at Tiwanaku, Bolivia, is a curiously carved rock at Conconcha near Abancay, Peru, and on the famous carved rock called Kenco near Cusco. are little flights of stairs which are carved for ceremonial or ornamental purposes and which serve no useful object as far as one can see. The stairways of Machu Picchu, on the other hand, with possibly one exception, all appear to be available for reaching locations otherwise difficult of access. At the top of Machu Picchu, a peak that's rarely ever shown in photos, is a spring of fresh water. Bingham discovered that the Inca had engineered an aqueduct system that spanned nearly a mile down the ridgetop from the spring to the heart of the city. It zigzagged between giant granite boulders and ran through narrow tunnels built deep into the foundations of the city. As the aqueduct tunnels narrowed, it increased the pressure of the water before spilling out into finely cut and elegant granite fountains in the heart of the city. Now, at the Sacred Plaza, the primary temple with the largest megalithic cyclopean stones, Bingham makes an interesting observation that even to this day, most people don't recognize. He found that one of the largest granite stones was cut into numerous different angles to fit the smaller blocks sitting on top of it. And when he counted all of the angles up, he realized that the 12-angled stone that everyone admires in Peru was far outnumbered by the 32 angles on this stone that was already several times larger. Not only were the lower portions of two of the niches with which this house is lined cut out of the stone, but in a spirit of almost freakish ingenuity or playfulness, the builders carved part of the corner of the room itself in this extraordinary block so that it even forms a very small part of one of the end walls. In the palace of the Inca Roca in Cusco is a stone made famous by early Spanish writers because it had 14 angles. Visitors always look at it. This stone has 32 angles. Bingham was so amazed by this part of the city, in fact, he even goes on to tell that the niches within the walls were so precisely carved out that your eyes alone could not find differences between the stone masonry of the niches, and that while there may be some ancient sites around the world which were close or equal to the beauty of this city, certainly none surpassed Machu Picchu. It stood alone in being one of the most impressively built and beautifully set ancient sites in not only the Americas, but all of the world. In the selection of the ashlars, in the finish of the blocks, in the proportions of the room, and in the artistic care with which it was built, it is among the very finest of ancient buildings. Others may equal it in beauty, but I know of none which surpasses it. It gives abundant evidence that here at Machu Picchu was one of the finest sanctuaries ever built by the Incas or any other prehistoric Americans. With the sheer monumentality and scale of the stonework within the Sacred Plaza, it made sense to Bingham that this was the central, innermost, important section of all the city. But he couldn't make out what exactly this space was intended to be used for. He wondered if the monumental size of the stone wasn't to glorify the Inca ancestors or past emperors whose mummies could be put on display within the niches or windows of the temple walls. Upon examining the top corners of the walls, he determined that the temples likely wouldn't have had roofs, but instead the open side without a wall would have been covered by a huge, elegant textile. Imagine a hanging carpet acting as a screen between the outside and inner temple. The top of the temple would have maintained its open roof, allowing the mummies to bask regularly in the sunlight, which a mummy needs to maintain its good condition. It's possible that the Inca viewed the sun as giving and preserving life for both the living and the dead in this fashion. No pains were spared to make this unique structure conform to all that was best and most solid in the architecture of the Incas. Its builders had a remarkable sense of symmetry. They matched niche for niche and almost matched block for block. No building in Peru gives a finer impression of the high stage of art and architecture reached by the ancient people of the Andes. Returning back to the amazing temple that Bingham first came across on his first visit, the Temple of the Sun, which he believed may have housed a priest, as this temple was very reminiscent of the Sun Temple found in Cusco, Bingham reports that possibly the greatest stonemason to ever live was at work here, fitting and joining the blocks together perfectly in a seamless fashion that rivaled the stonemasonry of the great temples of the Old World. Bingham wasn't able to see the temple in its entirety during his first visit, as the overgrowth had hidden it so greatly, but upon finally freeing the temple from the vegetation, he found that the blocks fit together so precisely that the vegetation simply laid over the stones and could not grow between the blocks or pull them apart. This really is one of the finest examples of ancient Peru's razor-sharp megalithic architecture, something that I personally can't think of a rival for. even in Egypt. After we had scrubbed the wall clean, we discovered that the most experienced master mason of his time had here constructed the most beautiful wall in America, built in the form of a tri-square and connecting the temple with what may have been a priest's house. The effect is softer and more pleasing, if less splendid, than that of the marble temples of the Old World. Here we have an example of the remarkable ability of the Inca architects. Since this wall was obviously built with the utmost care by an artist who desired it to be a permanent object of beauty, it was necessary that there should be no cracks in it, that the seams between the closely fitting ashlars should never open. He found an enclosed area of the city, which by measuring its luxurious layout in close proximity to the city's fountains, he determined these rooms must have been the king's group, or as he thought it should have been called, the palace of the emperor. This group was not made of the same precisely cut blocks as the Sun Temple or Sacred Plaza, but its stonework was very solid, still exceeding the quality of stonework found throughout most of the ancient American world. And it's possible that that world-class megalithic architecture that you can find at so many Inca sites was something that is only reserved for spiritualistic or religious purposes, such as communing with past deceased emperors who have now become one with the divine and worshiping the sun, which really involved much more than just simple and primitive sun worship, and instead required the priest to act as an astronomer, tracking the sun's path and informing the entire civilization of the coming seasonal changes, as well as probably much more that must be lost to us today. In this king's group, he found that the doorways came complete with 3-ton megalithic lintels sitting above the doorways, whereas the other homes had much smaller duolithic lintels that could have been put up by 2 strong men working together. Whoever had this group of homes built was able to overcome the obstacle of lifting infeasibly large stones to use as doorway lintels. This feat, as well as many other things, continually puzzled Bingham, as there was no evidence as far as he knew that the Inca had pulleys, cranes, or winches. The only device he could imagine was that the builders created small ramps alongside the walls to pull the blocks up before setting them into place. This, however, also seems a bit problematic. It's still an unsolved mystery. These rooms were luxuriously large, and as anyone familiar with ancient construction might know, large and enclosed rooms are incredibly rare in the ancient world. Building a roof large enough to enclose a huge space was something that not many ancient civilizations could achieve. Even in Egypt, it is very rare to find a large room with a roof. He also noticed that these rooms had no outside windows, perhaps to give privacy to the imperial family. The entrance to the king's group also sits directly next to the highest level of the fountain, meaning that the servants would have no trouble quickly fetching pots of the freshest and untouched water. Now, in the modern day, there are rumors and stories of people finding or locating or hearing about hollow areas and man-made tunnels beneath the city of Machu Picchu. Some say they are just natural cavities or hollow areas that are a natural result of the construction of the city's foundation. But others claim to know of the existence of actual man-made tunnels hidden beneath the city. Man-made chincanas, often created to be used for a ritualistic purpose, such as the transition between the earthly world and the underworld in Inca cosmology. Only the priests and elites would be allowed to enter these spaces, and it makes sense that the Inca would have created a subterranean space here, as no tunnel-like caves exist naturally on the mountaintop, or at least none that have been found thus far. But these stories aren't just wild fantasies with no basis at all. These stories actually begin with Hiram Bingham himself. Our first task was to see whether excavation in the principal structures would lead to the unearthing of potsherds or artifacts which might throw light on the former inhabitants. Our workmen, who fully believed in the quote-unquote buried treasure theory, started with a will. Tests made with a crowbar in the principal temple enclosure resulted in such resounding hollow noises as to give them assurance that there were secret caves beneath the floor of the ancient temple. Amid the granite boulders under the carefully constructed floor, our excavation was carried to a depth of 8 or 9 feet. But all this back-breaking work ended in only disappointment. Although we penetrated many crevices and holes between the boulders, there was nothing to be found, not even a bone or a potsherd. As the excavations continued, the team was continually coming up empty-handed. No complete potsherds, no gold, no bronze tools, no idols, not even a skull. Nothing was found. Bingham came up with a treasure hunt. He told the workmen that he would pay any man who could explore around the city's greater area and find a burial cave with an intact skull or body and leave it exactly as they'd found it. 2 days later, all of the workmen showed back up, tattered, cut, and bruised from the harsh terrain, and not one of them had found a burial cave. Luckily though, Bingham's native friends he'd met with when he'd first arrived in the area had more luck. Or perhaps they already knew where the burial caves were located. I think the second option seems more likely. Late in the second day, his native friends returned to camp with great smiles, claiming they'd just found 8 burial caves and wanted $8 for their efforts. Now, $8 was a considerable amount of cash for these native men, and Bingham was happy to pay it, even though he knew that they already knew where they were. The day after Riccardi and his friends had reported the discovery of 8 burial caves, Dr. Eaton and I followed them across the ruins of the city and plunged down the wooden slope on the eastern side of the ridge until we reached a moss-covered ledge under which was a small cave to which our guides proudly pointed. Sure enough, here were the bones of a woman, about 35 years old, a representative of the middle coast region of Peru, and possibly one of those attractive types who were commanded by Inca Titu Cusi to attempt the seducing of the Augustinian fathers who wished to enter the city of Vilcabamba the Old. Judging by the position of the bones, she had been buried in the usual contracted position, the knees drawn up to her chin. With her were buried the remains of her cooking pots and food vessels. The second cave yielded fragments of 2 small adult skulls, but no pottery or bronze. In the third cave, my joy knew no bounds when I was able to lay hands for the first time at Machu Picchu on a perfect piece of Inca pottery. It was an excellent specimen of a 2-handled dish nicely decorated. This cave was divided into 2 parts by a stone wall. The outer section contained the skeleton of a woman about 35 years of age, the skull being of the oblong type usually found in the mountain regions. Ultimately, Bingham would go on to find more than 50 different burial caves, hanging off sheer granite cliffs on the north side of the mountain. No gold or incredibly ornate specimens of pottery would be found though. Bingham wondered if the natives had not already discovered each of these burial caves and pawned the greater findings to travelers coming through the area. They discovered another batch of caves containing the remains of around 60 mummies some 800 feet below and 1,000 yards east of the first set of burials. None of the skulls of the mummies showed any sign of trepanation, which was a skull and brain surgery known to have been performed across the ancient Americas, where surgeons would drill a hole into the skull of typically a warrior who'd sustain a head injury during battle. Or at least that's what experts tend to think. These skulls were very common around Peru in particular, and the fact that none of these could be found here indicated to Bingham that either warriors did not live in this city or there were no battles to be fought in this area, playing into the idea that whatever the city was, it was a hidden sanctuary, intended to be separated from the rest of the South American world. Here they also found royal women, high-ranking priestesses, and the remains of bodies they could tell were important figures due to their burial remains and their healthy-looking mummies. Buried with the high priestess, they found bronze hairpins, bronze jewelry with elegant hammered designs of birds, fine fabrics of wool, and even the mummified body of her clearly beloved dog, which was a border collie-like breed that was loved by the Incas. It was obvious that her grave was undisturbed, but it still struck Bingham as peculiar that not a flake of gold could be found among her burial goods. Grave after grave after grave they discovered, almost all with evidence of being disturbed, either by treasure hunters in recent centuries, or the mummies and their grave goods being swept into the corner and bunched together to make room for more mummies during the time before the city was abandoned. In the oldest cemetery near Snake Rock, Bingham excavated a load of green quote-unquote record stones, which he believed were used as a form of record keeping prior to the Inca invention of the quipu, which is an undeciphered system of rope knot tying and mathematical formulas used to keep records. Bingham had seen these kind of record stones before, but instead from faraway places like Ecuador. It made him wonder if these were not buried here by a culture who lived at this site long before the Inca. And I have to admit, every single time that I visited Machu Picchu, which is some 4 or 5 times now, I have always made it a point to ask one of the local guides working there, what is the oldest archaeological evidence of habitation at Machu Picchu. And every single time I've gotten the answer of 2,000 to 4,000 years ago. I even think one time I was told that there was evidence of habitation dating back 5,000 to 7,000 years. Now, I could find nothing online that actually verified this or official findings, but if you go to Machu Picchu, they'll tell you. Now, some experts may just brush that off as pseudoscience or myths or local legends, but let me remind you that it was the local natives that showed Hiram Bingham where Machu Picchu was. So just keep that in mind. One of my favorite quotes ever actually comes from a mentor of mine and my good friend, Dr. Edwin Barnhart. In my own experience as an explorer, it's almost always the case that the locals knew where the lost places were all along. The discoverer is just the first person to ask the right questions. After all of his exploration and excavation, Bingham was convinced that the lost city, which sat on the ridge of the mountain Machu Picchu, was in fact the catalyst for much of the Inca world, and that its grand architecture predated and inspired the temples of Cusco and was later retrofitted as the last capital of the Inca realm during its final days. If my theory of Machu Picchu as Tampu Tocco is correct, it may be that the principal sanctuary in Cusco, now the Dominican monastery but known to the conquistadors as the Temple of the Sun, was built during the reign of the Incas as an echo on a large scale of the semicircular temple at Machu Picchu. If this latter temple was constructed above the cave where tradition says Pachacuti VI, last of the Amautas, was buried, it would naturally have been the most revered spot at Machu Picchu. Certainly the stonework of its surroundings has rarely been equaled and never surpassed in beauty and strength. When the Incas left Tampu Tocco, therefore, and took up their residence in Cusco, nothing would have been more likely than for them to have built their first temple in a manner resembling the finest temple at Machu Picchu. Bingham confidently believed he'd found not only the lost last temple of the Inca, but the birthplace of the first Inca emperor in the city that had existed and predated the Inca realm, inspiring the incredible stonework found throughout South America. Many decades later, though, Bingham was proven wrong about one thing. The initial settlement of his city may have predated Inca civilization, and it could have been the birthplace of the first Inca emperor, but he didn't find Vilcabamba, the last capital. In 1964, 8 years after Hiram Bingham's death at 80 years old, another American explorer named Jean Savoy located a lost city in a lowland jungle region known as Espiritu Pampa and excavated about 300 buildings there. Ultimately, the location and description of that site matched the Spanish descriptions perfectly, and it very quickly became accepted that Savoy had indeed found the actual lost capital of Vilcabamba. So, what had Bingham actually found? Well, we still don't know, and this is really the great mystery of Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu is a lost city in the truest sense of the words. Even when Vilcabamba was the secretive final refuge for the Inca, Vilcabamba's name was still spoken, and the Spanish were able to use this oral trail to track the city down and conquer it. Machu Picchu, however, when the city was abandoned sometime during the conquest period, its name was never uttered. You cannot find even a vague mention of a city name that could be given to Machu Picchu anywhere in the Spanish accounts of what they learned from the Incas. It is apparent in the feeling alone of standing within the city that it was a place unlike others, a divine sanctuary likely meant as a paradise refuge from the outside world, an academy for the study of the sun, moon, and stars, and a secluded site to connect and commune with the ancestors, with undoubtedly more purposes that have been lost to time. When the Inca abandoned this place, they never uttered its name again. And perhaps that silence, more than anything else, tells us the importance of what Bingham actually found. I'm Luke Caverns. Thank you so much for joining me, and like and subscribe for more stories of exploration on the edges of the world. So if you're not dead as a dodo, as they say, I'm sure you've at least heard of the dodo bird and that they went extinct sometime in the past. But most people don't even know where the dodo bird lived or when it disappeared. They just assume it must have gone extinct in prehistoric times like many other extinct species such as the woolly mammoth and saber-toothed cat. But actually, the dodo bird existed just a few hundred years ago, alongside 11 other extinct species. The real story of the first explorers who found the dodo bird and why the dodo went extinct is one of the wildest stories I've ever uncovered. My name's Luke Caverns, I'm an American explorer, and I come from a lineage of explorers who searched for lost Spanish treasure and ancient artifacts in the American Southwest dating back to the 1890s. And this is the first explorers. So the reason that most people have never actually heard the real story of the discovery and the extinction of the dodo is because the original accounts of the island were written in Dutch and were never translated into English, and the documents that were translated into English were published once in 1601 and are extremely difficult to track down today. But I did track down the first-hand accounts of the Dutch explorers and sailors who discovered the island as well as the dodo bird between 1598 and 1710. And through these accounts, I was able to piece together the real, wild, unhinged story of Dodo Bird Island. And as far as I know, this will be the first time that this story has ever been told in this way. This is the word-for-word account of the first recorded discovery of the dodo bird and its extinction. So during the 1500s, the Americas were not actually the only new lands being discovered. Not even close. There was another entirely new world, almost entirely unknown to Europeans, that was still being explored and discovered bit by bit. This was the Indo-Pacific, or the East Indies, and the surrounding islands in the Indian Ocean, down to the Arctic. This undiscovered realm stretched from the islands off the coast of East Africa all the way to New Zealand. Although there were Europeans exploring these lands to discover unknown civilizations, societies, biomes, and plant and animal species, the overwhelming reason for the European discovery of the Indo-Pacific came down to one reason alone: access to the spice trade. From medieval times all the way until the early 1800s, spices were the most lucrative commodity on the entire planet. For centuries, spice was the only known way to effectively preserve meat through the long winters of Europe. Spice could mask the scent of spoiled food, spice became a demonstration of wealth, and even found uses in medicine. The expeditionary voyages that set out to discover and accumulate spices in the Indo-Pacific could easily yield a 1,000 to 3,000% profit. But there were many, many risks. And the most common risks were the silent killers, such as disease, such as scurvy, dysentery, and typhus. Their mouths were so rotten that the teeth fell out with a touch. The gums were swollen like sponges and stank horribly. Some had their legs swollen as thick as a man's waist, black and shining, and when pricked, the blood ran like syrup. Many died raving mad, crying for oranges and lemons that were not there. Beyond this, a single navigational error could send a ship or an entire fleet into an unknown storm in the middle of the night, attempting to navigate the pitch black waters, ultimately toppling and sinking the ships. This wasn't a rare occurrence. However, if you could survive these risks for 18 to 24 months and return to Europe with a load of spice, the profits were astronomical, totaling up to a sum equal to a range of $100 to $270 million in today's currency. Dodo Island, which is called Mauritius today as it was named by the Dutch after the Dutch prince, was actually known to Arab sailors who called it Dina Arobi as early as 900 AD. However, I prefer to call it Dodo Island, and I will continue to refer to it as such from here on. Although it appears on 1100-year-old Arab maps, we have no documentation of Arab sailors exploring or settling the island, simply sailing past it while going along their trade routes. 600 years later, in 1507, the Portuguese spotted the island, visited it, and recorded it, but made no permanent settlement, and no surviving documents tell us today what they found or saw on the island. So that's why Dodo Island was discovered, but what did the first explorers actually find? The first written account of exploration on the island comes from Dutch sailors in 1598, nearly an entire century after the Portuguese visited the island, when Van Warwick's fleet of 5 ships anchored in a bay of the island 3 months after setting sail from Holland. Dodo Island is located just off the coast of East Africa, on the other side of Madagascar. As far as the Dutch could tell, no humans had ever lived there, and the island had never been settled. There were no footpaths found anywhere across the island. The only reason anyone would have stopped here is to rest or forage supplies while using the prevailing winds which cross the island's path on your way further east toward Indonesia. The island was beautiful though, mountainous and covered in thick green forest, banded together by perfectly white beaches and coral reefs that surrounded the island. The valleys of the island were filled with spectacular rivers and streams of fresh water. The sea around the island was bright blue and green, and the air was refreshing and untouched. By this point in history, there were very few places left on the earth where one could walk through a pristine, untouched wilderness that had looked the same for eons before mankind. The island is very pleasant to behold, being high land full of woods with very fine and delicious smell coming from the woods. The land is mountainous, but the mountains are covered in very beautiful green trees right up to the top. The island is surrounded by a rim of white sand beaches and coral reefs. Inside it is very mountainous and covered with ebony and other fine woods. We found the air very healthy and temperate. There were a few critters scurrying throughout the island. The Dutch explorers found goats, pigs, rats, and even species of monkeys known as rhesus, known only to be found in East Asia. It was surprising to find these monkeys here. The Dutch assumed that these animals had been released here by the Portuguese explorers nearly a century before. Among the island's dense interior, the Dutch did not find a single four-legged mammal that was native to Dodo Island. They did, however, discover a staggering number of giant tortoises, measuring 4 to 5 feet long and weighing up to 650 pounds each. Land turtles are here in such incredible numbers that one can walk on their backs for half an hour or more along the beach. The two species of giant tortoise that lived on Dodo Island were the domed and saddleback tortoises. And along with the dodo bird, both of these giant species are also extinct today. They were so large that 8 men could sit on the back of a single tortoise. They were so common, the Dutch said, that they could be found in quote-unquote infinite numbers throughout the island. You could walk on top of their shells for half an hour along the beach without even touching the sand. They loaded 50 to 200 of these tortoises onto each ship to use as food for the coming journey, and noted that the tortoises could go up to a full year without having food or water before dying. Sounds like a miserable existence for the tortoises though. The Dutch write that the extinct tortoise's flesh was filling and tasted like beef, and that when its fat melted, it was better than the finest olive oil. Along with these, they also found other reptiles, dozens of undiscovered species of lizards and geckos with beautiful assortments of colors that were found throughout the island. But even more common than the giant tortoises, the island was filled with hundreds of thousands of birds and bats. They record seeing bats that looked like flying foxes with wings that soared like eagles. They slept in enormous colonies hanging from the tree branches during the day and swirled overhead in giant clouds around the island at dusk. And of course, the Dutch had to try some bat meat as well. They said it tasted like rabbits and it was very good when roasted. But the most peculiar thing that the Dutch found on the island, as thousands of different birds of all type were swirling over their heads, were the odd, fat, flightless birds found wandering throughout the island. They called them wallow birds, and the Dutch journals give a fascinating account of their very first interactions with these funny little bizarre creatures. They describe the birds as being comically large, so fat that a man could barely lift one. Modern research suggests they probably weighed around 50 pounds. But if you tried to pick one up, they wouldn't run away because they had no fear of humans. Even if they tried to run, they were hardly capable as their fat little bodies waddled around the forest floor and open clearings of the island. They waddled around the island searching for fallen fruit, which the Dutch record was the primary aspect of their diet, and this is probably the reason they were such healthy birds. They had large heads and beaks with tiny wings that served no function as far as the men could tell, and their legs were short and thick. Sailors recorded that they made loud goose-like noises when they were angry from being picked up, but usually cooed and mumbled like a pigeon. They weren't flocking birds, and at most could be found in pairs of 4 to 5 wandering the island together. They even noted that dodos nested on the ground and were monogamous pairs that laid only one large egg at a time and raised usually a single chick at a time. Modern scientific research suggests that the dodo bird's most recent ancestor was a flying pigeon that reached the island some 4 to 5 million years ago. But as they had no natural predators and an entire landmass rich with fallen fruits and nuts to be eaten, they lost their need for flight to escape predators and evolved from a standard ancient pigeon weighing around half a pound to a giant, round, 50-pound flightless dodo, without a need for fear in over 4 million years. This was literally bird heaven for millions of years. When Rome fell, the dodos were there. When the pyramids were built, the dodos were there. When the bow and arrow was invented 60,000 years ago, the dodos had already been there for almost 4 million years. When the first Homo sapiens appeared in Africa, the dodos had been on their island paradise for eons by then. But unfortunately, after over 4 million years, the glory days of dodo paradise was now behind them. And I think that these quotes that I found from Dutch sailors really encapsulate why dodo paradise came to an end. They are very fat, and when caught, they cannot run fast. We took as many as we pleased, for they do not flee or fight, but stand still and let themselves be taken. These wallow birds are so heavy and clumsy that when they run, they fall over their own feet. A sailor can catch them by simply walking behind and tapping them on the back. They are too fat to turn quickly. The bird is so stuffed with fat that when you hit it with a stick, it barely staggers, then just stands there looking offended. In all reality though, it takes a lot of food to feed 200 or 300 men who are at sea for 18 to 24 months. And the dodo bird, as well as many other bird and tortoise species, presented quite a robust all-you-can-eat buffet of good protein and calories. By 1611, it was Dutch policy for every ship to essentially refuel food and supplies on Dodo Island before continuing their journey. All ships shall touch at the island of Mauritius to refresh the crews with tortoises and birds, of which there are great plenty and very tame. So from then on, for the next 80 years, every single Dutch fleet that passed through on its way to Indonesia made a pit stop on Dodo Island to load up on dodo, tortoise, and other birds' meat before setting sail towards the east again. In 1638, they established an official colony along with a stone fort called Port Warwick. We have built a fort in a small village at the fine harbor on the southeast side of the island, which we named Port Warwick after our Admiral Van Warwick, who first discovered it in 1598. Now, the town never grew bigger than just a few homes, a warehouse, a sawmill, and the fort. At its height in the 1650s, the population was probably around 150 Dutchmen. Other than Port Warwick, the Dutch never founded any other villages or towns on Dodo Island. The rest of the island remained untouched, except for the walking paths and hunting trails that spread across most of the island. Most of the men spent their days hunting or cutting logs, while singing obscenely vulgar Dutch songs to entertain themselves. The Dutchmen at Port Warwick were essentially the most unhinged and drunken colony of the entire Dutch Empire. The governors appointed to be in charge of the colony basically gave up trying to control the drinking problem and regularly wrote back to the Dutch mainland, "Everyone is drunk all the time." The daily ration for alcohol was about the equivalent of 10 to 12 shots of gin, but in reality the men drank about twice that amount, as the storehouse was always getting broken into. Eventually, no one bothered guarding the storehouse either. Then in 1658, 38 disgruntled Dutchmen, probably going mad from boredom, stormed the storehouse, stabbed the governor, and declared themselves kings of Dodo Island for 3 days. There is more Iraq drunk here in 1 month than in all of Batavia in a year. The men sell their clothes, their muskets, even the company's nails for one more bottle. We have hanged 6 this year for drunken murder. When the last ship left, we had 94 people on the island. 82 were drunk, 8 were sick from drink, and 4 were children who will probably start tomorrow. What had been a paradise of the dodo birds for eons was now some kind of hell or purgatory for the Dutchmen. The lifespan of a Dutchman on Dodo Island was less than 3 years, most dying from delirium, madness, alcohol poisoning, or being found dead in the morning after drowning in 2 feet of water while intoxicated. This is obviously not the environment where anyone is even giving a second thought as to preserving and protecting a finite species that's isolated on an island. And as the years went on, dodo and giant tortoise sightings became more and more rare. Since the large birds near the fort are all eaten, we now send parties of 10 men with dogs along the marked trails to the center of the island. They are gone 3 or 4 days and return with only a dozen dodos and 1 or 2 tortoises. There were a few uncharted and unexplored corners of the island where the vegetation grew thick, and the few trails that had been cut earlier that century were now completely overgrown. Occasionally, some Dutchmen and Africans would desert the colony, preferring to take up a new life as castaways, living in these far corners of the island. The deserters often lived much more comfortable and prosperous lives than the regular Dutchmen and refused to return to the colony. They fished, foraged for fallen fruit, and hunted hogs and goats left behind by the Portuguese. Eventually, orders were sent out among crewmen on arriving Dutch ships to expand or repair the old trails and hunt down these deserters. And when the Dutchmen finally penetrated into these deeper, uncharted corners of the island, they found that the runaways had built entire villages far more grand and prosperous than the colony itself. They were rich with resources and had all of the cooked meat and fruit they could have wanted. They built wooden huts on tall earthen mounds, very similar to Native Americans. Some deserters had even run off with the few women who were brought to the island, of which they now had children and had begun agriculture and were now cultivating small gardens of corn and sweet potatoes. The Dutch deserters were now living as Dodo Island's first native inhabitants. Except where we think of natives making stone tools such as spear points and clubs, these people of Dodo Island had stolen swords, muskets, axes, and machetes. The deserters now live in proper villages with palisades and watchtowers of bamboo. They laugh at us and say that the island belongs to them. As far as we can tell, Dodo Island's first native inhabitants took careful measures to not expend their natural resources, living as in balance with their environment as possible. They never hunted the dodo bird and only ate as many of the giant tortoises as they needed. They dreaded returning to the colony so fiercely that they melted scraps of iron from stolen goods and forged them into spear points, viciously attacking any Dutchman attempting to capture or force them to return to the colony. By 1710, the Dutch colony had vaporized the ebony tree population on the island, and new hunting parties scarcely could find a giant tortoise, and sightings of dodo birds were essentially non-existent, or if they were almost mythical. Everyone's saying that they knew someone who knew someone that had seen one. But by this point, the last official sighting of the dodo bird had been 48 years earlier in the year 1662. Among the crew who went into the woods, we still saw some dodos, but they are becoming very rare. I myself saw 2 of them together. So in 1710, the Dutch abandoned the island, leaving the Dodo people to live in peace for the next 5 years until the French arrived on the shores of Dodo Island in 1715. The French arrived with the intention of establishing sugar plantations, and when the French sailors explored further into the interior and found the native villages, they systematically hunted down all of the people of Dodo Island, killed or captured them, and burned their villages to the ground. In the decades to follow, any of the few surviving dodo birds were killed and eaten, as well as not only the giant tortoises on Dodo Island, but also the giant tortoises living undisturbed on the surrounding islets nearby. Ultimately, the destruction of Dodo Island led to the extinction of not only the dodo bird and the 2 giant tortoise species, but also many other species. The total list includes the dodo bird, the saddleback giant tortoise, the domed giant tortoise, the Mauritius giant skink, the red rail, the broad-billed parrot, the night heron, the Mauritius duck, the blue pigeon, the Mauritius shelduck, and the Mauritius owl. All 11 of these species went extinct within 100 years of the Dutch settling on the island in 1598. For the dodo bird, it took only 60 years of hunting for the entire population to vanish. The story of Dodo Island is proof that island ecosystems are perhaps the most fragile place on the planet, and that when the natural world makes contact with reckless humanity, all of it is put in danger. The dodo didn't go extinct because it was fat, slow, or stupid. It went extinct because it was perfectly adapted to a paradise that stopped existing the day Dutch sailors anchored on the island. In 1597, Dodo Island was one of the last untouched lands left on the planet. It was a natural paradise whose environment reflected the primordial world that existed long before humans appeared in Africa. But by the year 1700, it was a graveyard for 11 species that the world may never see again. Or at least we long thought we might not see them again. In 1651, English naturalist John Tredescant acquired a preserved, dried specimen of a dodo bird's head and foot, the result of wealthy European fascination with collecting oddities from around the world. But by the time the Dutch had abandoned Dodo Island in 1710, there were only 2 other known preserved remains that even confirmed the existence of the dodo bird. Then, in 1865, naturalist George Clark was exploring a dried-up swamp bed on the southeast end of the island when he came upon a massive bone bed, revealing thousands of subfossil bones. These bones belonged to not only the dodo bird, but also other extinct species from the island. It was a miracle that something like this had been preserved. Amazingly, the analysis with radiocarbon dating dated the remains to be about 4,200 years old. This was the first official discovery of a dodo bird skeleton ever. Then, 158 years later, in January of 2023, Colossal Biosciences announced its initiative to bring back the extinct dodo bird. By studying and examining the surviving specimens and finally detecting viable raw DNA for reference genomes, it is possible that the dodo bird will become one of the most groundbreaking achievements of de-extinction in world history. Who knows, perhaps someday there will be a sanctuary on Dodo Island where visitors can come to see the de-extinct species that used to roam the untouched island. I'm Luke Caverns, thank you so much for joining me. Like, subscribe, and check out the First Explorers merch for more stories of exploration on the edges of the world. So, the story of the first explorers of the Olmecs is one of the greatest stories of discovery and exploration around a truly lost ancient civilization that is never told. I just returned home from my 4th expedition to the Olmec world, and in fact, the very first ancient megalith I ever saw was the largest head discovered at the site of La Venta. I was immediately captivated. The Olmecs had risen, reached their peak, and fallen before the rest of ancient America had really even begun. It's possible that the Aztecs, who rose nearly 3,000 years after the Olmecs, never even knew the Olmecs had existed. We have no idea what the Olmecs called themselves, what language they spoke, how their society worked, how their religion worked, or even the total impact they had on later ancient civilizations of Mexico. The Olmecs are a truly lost civilization. And from that day on, I've been captivated by everything involving the Olmec world. And it was definitely captivating to the first explorers. My name's Luke Caverns, I'm an American explorer, and I come from a lineage of explorers who searched for lost Spanish treasure and ancient artifacts in the American Southwest dating back to the 1890s. And this is the first explorers. There were no headlines written about the discovery of the very first Olmec head. Nobody even seems to know the exact day in 1862 that it was found. It wasn't a treasure trove of Maya jade or a cache of Aztec gold. It was a colossal basalt head staring eternally off toward the horizon that had been found in the fields of Tres Zapotes by the Mexican explorer Jose Maria Melgar y Serrano. He published his findings in 1869 and described the facial features to be African. As a work of art it is, without exaggeration, a magnificent sculpture, but what astonished me most was the Ethiopian type it represents. I thought that without doubt there had been Negroes in this country, and that in the earliest ages of the world. While the locals around central Mexico had perhaps known of these ancient monuments popping up in the fields and being found in the forests, because of their lack of riches, the interest never really carried back to Mexico City, let alone other archaeological institutions in New York City or London. And so the head sat there in the fields of Tres Zapotes, half uncovered and untouched, for another 69 years. The story of the Olmec's first explorers is one of the most incredible and heroic stories that is never told, with some of the greatest explorers that nobody has ever heard of. And in fact, this may be the only video that's ever been made telling this story. In 1924, the University of Tulane organized their very own Department of Middle American Research and organized the first Tulane expedition to explore Chiapas, Tabasco, and Veracruz, Mexico, just a short boat ride south from New Orleans. The purpose of the expedition was to discover and document uncharted Maya sites, ruins, and monuments, collect artifacts and data, and produce scholarly publications to build the university's reputation in Middle American archaeology. Needless to say, the fact that we're talking about it today, this worked. And at the head of this expedition is one of the greatest explorers of all time, who almost nobody has ever heard of before, the great and restless Franz Blom. Personally, Franz Blom, like Percy Fawcett, is a hero of mine. He's an explorer that I resonate a lot with. At 32 years old, he was the perfect man to lead this precarious expedition into the remote heart of central Mexico that was just recovering from the devastation of the Mexican Revolution. Blom grew up in Denmark as an adventurous kid and an indifferent student, flunking many of his classes, dropping out of his art and philosophy classes, and constantly being in a state of wanderlust. Something out there far away was calling to him from a young age. That calling made him restless. By his mid-20s, his family cut him off and encouraged him to buy a one-way ticket to the Americas in 1919. He found work in Mexico's booming oil industry as a mapper and surveyor in the remote areas of Veracruz, Tabasco, and Chiapas. And it was in these jungles that Blom would come face to face with the silent ruins of a lost world. And it was here that he found what had been calling to him since he was a child. And although he didn't realize it yet, this was the reason he'd come to the Americas. He became disillusioned with the oil field surveys and had started returning back to the ancient sites he was finding in his free time to explore, sketch, and document the ruins. He kept detailed journals of his discoveries, and although it is not known how this meeting took place, Blom's work eventually made its way in front of a Maya archaeologist named Sylvanus Morley, who would quickly become a mentor for Blom. After contracting malaria in 1922, Blom left the oil industry and decided to pursue Maya archaeology full-time. It was his mentor through his connections that was able to arrange Blom's acceptance into Harvard University to study and train in archaeology for 2 semesters between 1923 and 1924. Through word of mouth, Tulane's new Middle American department saw Franz Blom as the youngest, fittest, and most experienced possible leader of the expedition, and his employment as a field explorer and archaeologist for Tulane University began on January 1st, 1925. On February 19th, Blom boarded the United Fruit Company steamship and departed from New Orleans across the Gulf of Mexico and made port in Veracruz sometime in early March. Although this scientific expedition was done in cooperation with the American University and the Mexican government, the law couldn't protect Blom from the remote corners of this country, where bandidos, who are leftover rebels from the revolution in the decade before, were still hiding out in the remote farmland and jungles, and didn't take kindly to unwanted visitors. Blom would have to negotiate or evade these encounters to survive, and the environment could kill as well. Most of the expedition would require Blom to wade through swamps, marshy islands, flooded plains, dense wetlands, and precarious volcanic mountainsides, all pelted with heavy rains, thick humid air, and the scorching Mexican sun, filled with mosquitoes which carry malaria, deadly insects, jaguars, crocodiles, and the America's deadliest snake, the fertile ants. The expedition would be carried out on foot, by boat, and on horseback, all of which present their own risks. From the city of Veracruz, they traveled south by train and then by horseback until they reached the pass into the mountainous Tuxtla region, a volcanic, rugged, forested mountain range that explorers would later come to realize was the prime quarry site for this lost civilization. Jumping off horseback and narrowly avoiding bandits hiding in the lawless wilderness, Blom cut his way with a machete through the thick vegetation up the side of the dormant volcano known as San Martin Pajapan. And it was near the top of the mountain he discovered, covered in forested overgrowth, a mysterious statue of a kneeling figure with features unlike anything he'd seen before. This is the first recorded discovery of an isolated Olmec monument outside of an Olmec city. Though Blom didn't know who the Olmecs were or that this monument was created by a civilization even older than the Maya, it was obvious that this statue had been deliberately brought to this location on the mountainside for a specific reason that was lost to time. For Olmec explorers like myself, this discovery is particularly interesting because it's an enormous statue hauled to the top of a volcano, away from any known Olmec city or settlement, which means that there must be more of these monuments placed on mountainsides in the unexplored corners of the Olmec realm. Blom's expedition headed further east into Tabasco, Mexico, traveling by boat along the long river stretches, by horseback in the drier regions, and then wading through chest-high waters in the insect-ridden swampy regions. And like some of you guys may remember from the First Explorers of Machu Picchu episode, where Hiram Bingham traveled along the Urubamba asking locals about the location of unvisited ruins, everywhere Blom went, he asked locals of ancient ruins they may have known of. However, in the Olmec realm, this can be especially tricky and hard to determine without completely excavating a site. Just a few weeks ago, I saw a collection of enormous hills south of the Olmec capital city of San Lorenzo that looked to be almost certainly Olmec pyramids, but more than 3,000 years of erosion has buried these structures to an almost unrecognizable point, especially if the forest has grown over them. Blom was brought to an enormous site that didn't seem to fit any known ancient culture. It was different from the art styles of El Tajín to its west, and it was different from the art styles of the Maya to the east. The archaeological site was named after the modern settlement nearby, which was called La Venta. It was here that Blom made his most significant Olmec discovery, La Venta Monument 1. And this is the exact colossal head that I saw on my first expedition to the Olmec realm. It was partially buried near La Venta's Great Pyramid, an enormous structure made up of over 200,000 tons of earthen fill, an absolutely enormous monument, and is often considered to be North America's oldest pyramid, although there may be some pyramids in the modern US that are much older. Recent studies on the pyramid have shown there to be a void in the center of the pyramid, potentially a burial chamber or some other kind of offering, as well as buried stone staircases lining each of the four sides of the pyramid. Hopefully someday the pyramid will be fully investigated. Also discovered were several megalithic altar stones, a monument depicting a traveler, whom I think might just be an ancient visitor from the Mediterranean, but I digress. A monument bearing the oldest depiction of the feathered serpent in known history, and thousands of tons of basalt columns and 5 mysteriously buried caches of serpentine stone arranged in detailed patterns. All of these materials were imported from 100 to 200 kilometers away, from the volcanic Tuxtla Mountains in the west and deep from within the Maya jungles of modern-day Guatemala to the east. It's clear that whoever built this site, procured these materials, and erected and carved these monuments was a powerful ancient civilization that didn't seem to fit into any known timeline. They came from a time before known history. Blom's expedition took him even further south, down into Chiapas, where he entered the western gem of the Maya world, Palenque. He documented many more unknown ruins and brought back to the US some of the most iconic photos ever taken of the lost cities hidden in the middle of the American jungles. But when Franz Blom left the Olmec world for the jungle ruins of the Maya, it would be another decade before the Olmec's greatest explorer would arrive to explore this primordial land. The Olmec's greatest explorer was born on August 28, 1896 in Salinas, California. His name was Matthew Stirling. He grew up on his grandfather's ranch in Salinas Valley, where he developed a curiosity for the ancient world by exploring the creek beds and collecting arrowheads. His grandfather fueled his interest and sparked a lifelong obsession with piecing together the ancient world of the Americas. After high school, he attended college at the University of California at Berkeley, where he studied anthropology and began training to be an ethnologist. Now, because of films like Indiana Jones, we often think of these great explorers of the ancient world as being solely archaeologists. They seem to go hand in hand. But as we've seen in this first Explorer series, that isn't exactly always the case. However, Stirling's studies were interrupted. A great war had been raging in Europe for the last 3 years, and in April of 1917, it had finally pulled in the United States. At 21 years old, Stirling was enlisted as a junior officer aboard a U.S. naval ship patrolling the waters of the Atlantic, protecting supply ships and scanning for German U-boats. It's not known if he saw combat, nor is it known what ship he served on, but it is likely that he experienced anti-sub engagements during his 2 years of service in the Atlantic from 1917 to 1919. He was honorably discharged and returned to California to complete his final year. During that last year before graduating in 1920, he encountered a photograph of a small ancient jade statue depicting what seemed to be a crying baby with facial features that are mixed with a jaguar. And for Olmec fans who have seen my other videos, you know exactly what this is. But in 1920, nobody had any idea of what this little jaguar baby was, where it had really come from, or who created it. But something about staring into the little blue jade figure, its fiery brows, feline eyes, and downturned lips, it ignited a curiosity in Stirling. He saw that this figure was unlike anything else in the known archaeological record. But again, nobody really knew where artifacts like this were coming out of Mexico, and there was no real opportunity to explore where it had come from. After graduation, Stirling found work as a museum aide at the Smithsonian from 1921 to 1924 in Washington, D.C., where he helped procure artifacts for the museum while earning a master's degree in ethnology. During this time, he went on several expeditions performing surveys among the native tribes of California and attempting to piece together their ancient past. Later in 1924, driven by the wanderlust of the cultures of the ancient world, Stirling would temporarily resign from his post at the Smithsonian to embark on a personal journey with his best friend to South America, visiting countries like Peru and Bolivia and possibly even Ecuador as well. Nothing was officially published about this journey, but the expedition exposed him to a world far distant from his own, as well as the rugged terrain that is to be expected when embarking upon great expeditions to uncharted, ancient, or rarely visited corners of the world. The next year, Stirling would embark upon his first major expedition, requiring him to be gone for 2 years. Sponsored by the Smithsonian, Matthew Stirling and the expedition crew set off for Papua New Guinea in 1925 on what would be known as the American-Dutch Expedition to Dutch New Guinea. After nearly 2 months at sea, the expedition arrived on the shores of Papua New Guinea with a mission to document uncontacted indigenous tribes, document their ways of life, customs, and religion, collect artifacts such as tools, weapons, art, and iconography, and conduct anthropological surveys of the indigenous societies located deep in the jungles of the island's remote interior. They cut their way with machetes deep into the interior regions of the island, navigating the dense jungles, rivers, and mountainous terrain, all on foot. Papua New Guinea is still one of the most unexplored regions on Earth. The island is filled with unknown and unnamed diseases with effects similar to malaria, but sometimes more significant. It is filled with hostile wildlife and cannibalistic, uncontacted tribes that don't take kindly to outsiders. After 2 years of exploring the island and surviving an onslaught of complications, Stirling's team conducted one of the most successful and dangerous expeditions ever conducted on Papua New Guinea. At 31 years old in 1927, with a worn machete in hand, Matthew Stirling emerged from the island jungles of Papua New Guinea as a seasoned, experienced, and competent leader and explorer of the unmapped and unknown world. Over the next several years, Stirling would categorize and comb over the data gathered from his expedition, as well as continuing his other duties at the Smithsonian while planning his next great expedition. And during this time, Matthew would meet someone who he would credit as his co-author and general coordinator for the rest of his life. A beautiful secretary named Marian Illig, who graduated the year before with a Bachelor's of Science, had been hired by the Smithsonian to assist Stirling with administrative duties. Looking back, her outgoing and enthusiastic personality was likely not only the reason Stirling fell head over heels for her, but quite possibly the very reason she got the job working in the ethnology department in the first place. As she revealed years later, she had to quote-unquote look up the definition of ethnology in a dictionary after getting the job. But she was sharp, charming, enthusiastic, and would become the love of Stirling's life. Their professional relationship soon turned personal, and over the next 2 years, they would do much more together than just clerical museum work. So here Matthew Stirling is, a 33-year-old, physically fit, field-hardened explorer with a high-ranking job at the Smithsonian while taking home the most beautiful and charismatic woman in the office. You can see why I like the guy. His next expedition in 1932 would take him away from Marion for nearly a year while he descended down into the dense, insect-ridden, and treacherous Amazonian jungles of eastern Ecuador to live amongst the Jivaro tribes, famous for their savage warriors and practice of shrinking heads. He documented their customs, ways of life, religious practices, how they conducted tribal warfare, and how they managed to shrink the heads of other tribal warriors they killed, all without himself being killed or having his own head shrunken and worn around the waist of an Amazonian warrior. No doubt, I'm sure he was looking forward to getting back to Marion. They were married almost immediately upon his return to the US in 1933 and promptly went on an adventurous honeymoon expedition to Florida, where they visited numerous native Floridian archaeological sites and studied Florida's native cultures. There, sponsored by the Smithsonian, the Stirlings would spend the next 4 years overseeing the exploration surveys, excavations, and documentation of ancient sites around Florida, as well as extending up to Macon, Georgia. All while his wife Marion, graduated from her secretary duties at the Smithsonian, was his right-hand man in every way, often looking over the data he gathered in the field, studying, organizing, and interpreting it. Little did she know that her training in analyzing excavated artifacts would help her make one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in all of the Americas. But we'll get to that soon enough. In 1938, the inseparable couple took their first field trip to Mexico together. It was intended to be a relaxing vacation, as Marion was now pregnant with their first child, but naturally evolved into taking sketchy riverboats and untrustworthy taxis across South Mexico's bumpy and muddy backcountry to finally check out the region in which that strange jade jaguar baby figure that Stirling had seen in a photo back in college had supposedly come from. And as all great explorers have done, Sterling started asking around about ancient monuments and ancient sites that the locals had seen or heard of before, and eventually caught wind of a giant head sitting half buried in a field outside the village of Tres Zapotes. This was the same colossal head that Jose Maria had seen in 1862, and now in 1938, finally, another explorer had come to see it. One of the main reasons that the Olmecs were never seen nor discovered until just the last 100 years is because of the remoteness of their heartland. Even in 1938, there were no proper roads that you could use to drive into Tres Zapotes. Only muddy and unmaintained wagon and horseback paths could get you there. And so, leaving Marion to stay behind at a hacienda in Tlacotalpan, Sterling set off on an 8-hour horseback ride crossing the rivers, low swamps, and bogs of remote Veracruz. Nothing is known about what else Sterling saw around Tres Zapotes during this initial visit, but along with the colossal head, he must have seen the enormous earthen mounds which made up the vast ancient city that can still be seen today, as muddy and wet as it must have been during Sterling's time as well. As the mysterious colossal head lay half buried, staring off into eternity, it captivated Sterling's imagination. He returned home and was immediately able to convince the Smithsonian and National Geographic to sponsor a real expedition to investigate not only the site of Tres Zapotes, but also the other unvisited large sites in the region, provided this first excavation goes well. The first official Olmec expedition in history was launched in December of 1938, just 88 years ago. It's important to remember that even at this time, nobody was sure of who made the colossal head or the earthen mounds nearby. Most assumed they were Western, later Maya, and largely dismissed the sites, assuming they were of lesser importance. But Sterling had a hunch that there was something more here, but even he had no idea was awaiting him, nor that he, at 42 years old, was about to become unquestionably the greatest Olmec explorer of all time. Again facing sketchy riverboats, chopping their way with machetes through dense jungle trails, and riding on horseback, the expedition had arrived in Tres Zapotes. The goal was to excavate and investigate the large mounds, perform surface investigations like surveying for stone tools, stone fragments, and pottery laying around on the ground, and to finally reveal the entirety of the colossal head laying half buried in the middle of the field. By spring, they had mapped out the entire ancient city with its numerous pyramids, collected loads of pottery, discovered what seemed to be one half of a stela containing markings that seemed to be similar to the bar and dot dating system that's found throughout Mesoamerica, and especially in the Maya world. This artifact in particular fascinated Marion and would lead to her making one of the greatest discoveries in the history of American archaeology. The crew also fully unearthed the original mysterious colossal head and even found a second head nearby. By the spring of 1939, the first Olmec expedition was coming to an end, but Sterling knew he was hot on the trail of more great discoveries. Later in the same year, Expedition 2 would shift focus to another site which seemed to bear similar features and monuments as Tres Zapotes, La Venta, the very same city which Franz Blom had come across some 15 years earlier. And it would begin here that Matthew Sterling would become one of the most prolific discoverers in history. Yet again, cutting his way with machetes through the dense jungle, enduring the heat, pelting rain, and disease hovering over the expedition's crew, they would explore, map, and investigate the site for a year, revealing some of the most iconic images of the Olmec world. At the heart of the city lies an enormous earthen pyramid comprised of over 200,000 tons of packed earth, and at the base of the pyramid, sticking halfway out of the ground, like the colossal head that Jose Maria had found all those years earlier, Sterling had found yet another colossal head at a different ancient city. After cutting back the jungle foliage, was found 3 megalithic altar stones, and finally Sterling had come face to face with the were-jaguar he'd seen in photos decades before while he was just a young college student. The altar thrones, like all other Olmec monuments he discovered, were carved out of fine-grained, very hard and heavy basalt, which had been transported over 90 kilometers from the Sierra de la Tuxtla volcanic belt through a means and mechanism by which even today is still unknown. The altar thrones were scenes, essentially snapshots of actual events that took place in this ancient civilization. They depicted mysterious jaguar people emerging from caves, either harnessing long cords stretched out across the ground or carrying babies, who also possess the human jaguar features, out of the cave. And what's happening in these scenes and how the were-jaguar cult functions in the Olmec society is something that I've been researching and exploring for several years now. So if you'd like to see me make a video breaking down what I've discovered about that, leave a comment in the comment section below. Sterling's second expedition was a huge success, and it seemed like no matter where Sterling's machete led him, he was bound to find more evidence of this strange lost civilization. By 1941, Expedition 3 was underway, and the Sterlings, along with their expedition crew, was headed back into the Olmec heartland to continue the investigations at La Venta. World War II was raging at this point and caused drastic supply shortages for the expedition. And while that was discouraging at first, nobody had any idea that this would be the most successful Olmec expedition thus far. Sterling's party cleared most of the archaeological site as the jungle had grown back thick in the last year. And over the next 2 years, they discovered 3 more colossal heads, 4 additional megalithic altar thrones, 4 megalithic stelae at the base of the Great Pyramid facing inward towards the city's central plaza, and 2 enormous offering caches containing 30 layers of buried serpentine mosaics weighing over 1,000 tons per cache. It was clear that Sterling's team had fully uncovered significant evidence of an ancient lost civilization that didn't fit anywhere within the understood timeline of the ancient Americas. Nobody would have guessed that the reason that you couldn't see the influence from the Olmecs was because the Olmecs had risen and fell far earlier. By the time the Maya had really begun to emerge with great power around 200 BC, the Olmecs had reached their height over 1,000 years earlier. But Sterling hadn't quite figured that out yet. He had a hunch that they might be Mesoamerica's oldest civilization, but still, he had to find the origins of this civilization. After all he discovered, Sterling's greatest expedition was still in front of him. But there were many, and I mean many, skeptics of the Sterling's work on the Olmecs, especially the idea that they were of early antiquity. Up to this point, the Maya reigned supreme. They were seen as the most sophisticated and oldest civilization in Mesoamerica. Archaeological giants like J. Eric Thompson and Sylvanus Morley, who, yes, was the mentor of Franz Blom, spent their entire career studying the Maya world and were immediately and viciously opposed to the idea that the Sterlings had come along and discovered a civilization that completely uprooted the understood timeline of the Americas. One thing in particular they opposed was Marion Sterling's estimate that the broken half of the stela they discovered years before at Tres Zapotes, I told you this would be important to remember, contained a broken date that placed the stela precisely at 32 BC. Marion analyzed the surviving half of the date, calculated it according to her understanding of the Mesoamerican bar and dot numbering system, and estimated that if the other half of the stela were ever found, it would prove that the stela was erected in 32 BC. And if she were proven correct, it would mean that writing, dating, possibly the science of astronomy itself, was not born in the Maya world, but instead was given to the Maya by an even older culture, the Olmecs. Marion Sterling was viciously scrutinized and attacked for this claim. She was accused of her work being sloppy, ill-thought, and misunderstanding the basic premises of Mesoamerican chronology, numerology, and dating methods. At the earliest, most Mesoamerican scholars placed the Olmecs somewhere around 400 AD or even later, possibly sometime after 1000 AD. They said that the Olmecs were simply just another one of the numerous and ephemeral cultures of Mesoamerica that rose and fell in the background, while the heavy-hitting cultures like the Zapotecs, Teotihuacan, and the Maya marched through the centuries. The Sterlings returned home to spend time with their children and to focus on administrative duties at the Smithsonian for the rest of World War II, as the funding for archaeological expeditions had run dry. As the next 2 years went by, Matthew was itching to get back in the field and find the origins of this mysterious civilization. Fortunately, Hitler had become the second warlord to fail to invade Russia during the winter. Berlin finally fell, the United States won the atomic war, and successfully delivered the sun to Japan. Twice. The United States benefited immensely from winning World War II. The American economy was booming, funding for new projects was practically falling out of the ears, and most people probably don't even know that the economic success from coming out on top of World War II also allowed us to uncover the world's sixth cradle of civilization: Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley, ancient China, Peru, and soon, Sterling would find his way to the next great cradle of civilization, the most successful and paradigm-shifting expedition of his career. The final expedition set off from Washington, D.C. in late January 1946. They took the long journey by train all the way down to Mexico City, traveled by car until they reached the Coatzacoalcos River, where they traveled by boat and then mule and horseback until they reached a town called Tenochtitlan, which had been settled by the Aztecs at the time of Spanish contact just 400 years before. It was here that the Sterlings had heard rumors over the years of unusually large mounds, terraces, and buried pyramids sitting undisturbed far off in the fields from the village. So yet again, with a machete in hand, the 50-year-old Matthew Sterling set off on not only the most successful expedition of his career, but one of the most successful, important, and paradigm-shifting expeditions of all time. He led his crew of 20 to 30 members over the rolling hills of the remote swamp and jungle lands of Veracruz, cutting their way through the vegetation, crossing snake-ridden streams, battling malaria and interactions with wildlife to a site now known as San Lorenzo. They set up camp and began mapping out the perimeters of the enormous ancient site. Indeed, these were terraces, rectangular plazas, pyramids, and long-range structures that had been buried by an untold amount of centuries. Surface finds around the enormous buried city showed what seemed to be early iterations of the pottery styles seen at La Venta, indicating to Sterling that this site may have been the formative place for the Olmec world. Heavy rain showers and flooding made the work slow at first, but soon enough Sterling would uncover the first large monument of the site. As you enter San Lorenzo today, you would absolutely never know, if you hadn't known prior, that this was the world's sixth cradle of civilization. It sits on an elevated plateau overlooking the river valleys below, which actually looks so much like the fertile and green river valleys of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley, which makes sense. To enter the site, you push open a rickety wooden cattle guard fence and walk into a cow pasture filled with ancient ruins that look like nothing more than small, unassuming rolling hills. Near the entrance is a small crater in the soft ground about 4 to 5 feet deep. That crater is the remaining evidence of Matthew Sterling's first major find and dig at San Lorenzo. It was here that the 30-ton colossal head known today as El Rey was discovered. As they dug down to reveal the colossal face staring eternally emerging from the ground, he knew that he had once again struck gold, or in this case, basalt. The next 8 weeks would be one of, or perhaps the most prolific run of archaeological discovery in all of history. By the end of the fourth expedition in April 1946, Matthew Sterling had uncovered over 200 more basalt monuments and statues from San Lorenzo, including San Lorenzo Colossal Head 1, Colossal Head 2, Colossal Head 3, Colossal Head 4, Colossal Head 5, Colossal Head 6, Colossal Head 7, Colossal Head 8, Colossal Head 9, and Colossal Head 10, as well as monuments 1 through 61, ranging from megalithic altar thrones to statues, circular altars, stelae, and much, much more. Present archaeological evidence indicates that their culture, which in many respects reached a high level, is very early and may well be the basic civilization out of which developed such high art centers as those of the Maya, Zapotecs, Toltecs, and Totonacs. This was undeniably the crown jewel of the Olmec realm. The earliest Olmec city, the formative period of the Olmecs, and the origin of their world. This was clearly an isolated high culture whose art styles and iconography was not influenced by any known ancient culture, containing pottery and ceramic styles consistent with the early pre-classic period. All the finds pointed towards the Olmecs being a culture that must have preceded all known high cultures of Mesoamerica. The relics of a lost chapter of time that no one knew existed, literally pushing back the age of ancient American civilization itself. Still, though, not all archaeologists were on board. The archaeologists who'd spent their entire career devoted to the Maya had had the origins of Mesoamerican civilization pulled out from under them, and they continued to criticize and belittle the work of Matthew Sterling's excavations and especially Marion Sterling's work on Stela C, which, if she were correct, would not only place the origins of Mesoamerican civilization in the Olmec realm, but also science, numerology, astronomy, and potentially even writing itself in the Olmec realm. This was a huge blow to Maya archaeology, and it's no surprise that opponents suggested her estimations about the missing half of the stela were completely wrong, suggesting that instead the other half of the broken stela will confirm that the Olmecs are a much younger civilization from around 400 AD or even after 1000 AD. When Mexican archaeologist and explorer Alfonso Zanil returned to continue the work at Tres Zapotes, the original Olmec city that the Sterlings had excavated all those years ago, he found the missing half of the stela. It was exactly what Marian predicted. She had been right all this time. Calculating and translating the dates resulted in precisely September 3rd, 32 BC. Irrefutable evidence that the Olmecs indeed had writing, numerology, dating, and probably astronomy before any other known civilization in Mesoamerica. There was no one left to argue. The Sterlings had found Mesoamerica's mother culture. Expedition 4, the final Olmec expedition, ended in late 1946. The Sterlings returned home to continue raising their family, and Matthew went back to his position as the director of the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology. But something was still puzzling Sterling. The original Olmec photo he'd seen in college, the same face that he saw so many times all across the Olmec world on nearly every single monument he excavated, the were-jaguar. Nowhere else in Mesoamerica's later cultures, the Maya, the Zapotecs, the Teotihuacanos, the Aztecs, the Toltecs, nowhere in these cultures had the were-jaguar ever been seen. Flipping through the data and photographs at the Smithsonian, Sterling had seen the were-jaguar in other places, in remote sites deep in the jungles of Central America, the jungles of Colombia and Ecuador, and high in the Andes of Peru. And so, like all great explorers whose souls are whipped on by the lure of adventure, Matthew Sterling, at 51 years old, returned to the wilds of ancient America. With a machete in hand, the 51-year-old explorer spent the rest of his career tracking down the path of the were-jaguar. From 1947 to 1953, he led 4 expeditions into the remote, dense wilds of Panama, tracking down evidence of were-jaguars and human-jaguar hybrids, looking to piece together the blank spot on the ancient map between the ancient civilizations of North and South America. He came across uncontacted tribes and documented their customs like he did with the tribes in Papua New Guinea. He discovered the oldest known ancient sites in Panama containing man-made mounds just like he'd seen among the Olmecs. He found artifacts of gold, pottery, stone tools, and stone weapons, and even depictions of the were-jaguar. In 1954, he led a short reconnaissance trip to Costa Rica, investigating ceramic artifacts that were clearly inspired or influenced by Mesoamerican artifacts. And in 1956 to 1957, he led his final expedition, returning to Ecuador where he'd studied the Jivaro tribes decades before in search of his were-jaguar. He discovered early pre-Columbian sites such as Tarqui, found deep in the jungled highlands of western Ecuador. Here, again, he discovered man-made earthen mounds like he'd seen among the Olmecs and in ancient Panama, as well as early period ceramic-style stone tools and stone weapons, and again, the were-jaguar. Since this final expedition in 1957, serious exploration and research into the origins of the were-jaguar and the greater world of the were-jaguar has been, well, virtually non-existent. And it's this amazing and almost completely unknown and certainly underappreciated story of the great explorer Matthew Sterling that makes me want to pick up the proverbial machete and continue this search for the were-jaguar. Ultimately, the Olmecs' first explorers, Jose Maria, Franz Blom, and Matthew and Marian Sterling, completely rewrote ancient American history, showing the world what revealing, exploring, and excavating a truly lost ancient civilization looks like. But there are still many more unanswered questions about the Olmecs that future explorers will have to pick up the machete to find out. We still don't understand how the Olmecs transported their megalithic monuments, how they gained so much power in the ancient world. We have no evidence of what they were trading in return for goods they received from around ancient Mesoamerica. We have no idea where the caves depicted in their monuments really are. We can't fully read their language, we don't fully understand their religion or iconography, and we have no explanation for how they appear on the archaeological timeline as a fully formed civilization with a sophisticated and iconic art style that should have at least taken centuries to develop. We don't know who the Olmec heads depict, whether they were kings, Mesoamerican ball players, or maybe both. And finally, we don't understand the cult of the were-jaguar. There are thousands of depictions of human-jaguar hybrids found throughout the Olmec realm, far more common than the colossal heads. and yet we barely understand it today. The Olmecs are the premier example of what a truly lost ancient civilization looks like. I'm Luke Caverns, thank you for joining me, and like and subscribe for more videos of exploration on the edges of the world. So, the story of the first explorers of Egypt's Osirion is one of the greatest stories of exploration and discovery around a truly mysterious ancient site that is almost never told. Of all the mysterious and enigmatic places that I've been to throughout the ancient world, the Osirion at Abydos may be the most mysterious. Not simply because we don't know what it is exactly or what it was used for, but because the more you learn about it, the less certain you become. It's a structure that rewrites itself the more it's studied. It's a monument that pulled curious explorers into its depth, and when they emerged again, they were left with even more questions than answers. And the first explorers who descended into it, into the darkness, the rising water, and the filling sand, walked away convinced that they were standing in the most ancient place in all of Egypt. My name's Luke Caverns, I'm an American explorer, and I come from a lineage of explorers who searched the American Southwest for lost Spanish treasure and ancient artifacts dating back to the 1890s. And this is the first explorers. There is an ancient city in southern Egypt that most people who visit Egypt never see. Abydos, a flat, sun-blasted stretch of the Nile Valley roughly 250 miles south of modern-day Cairo. It's one of those lesser-visited sites in Egypt where, if you stand still, you can hear the wind billowing through the halls of the ancient temple, and suddenly you're transported back to a very ancient time. Abydos is one of the most ancient and sacred places in all of Egyptian history, dating all the way back to the very beginning of the dynastic era around 3100 BC. And very likely is even more ancient than that, possibly reaching all the way back to the earliest times of the pre-dynastic era around 4000 BC. And over the course of several thousand years, pharaoh after pharaoh would visit Abydos to pay homage to this ancient place. And this is the mystery that the first explorers stepped into when they arrived in Abydos, a place of myth, ancient royalty, and the deep memory of a sacred site that, according to the Egyptians themselves, reached back to a time before time. And hidden behind the temple of Pharaoh Seti I, buried beneath the sand, the most inexplicable and mysterious site in all of Egypt was waiting to be uncovered: the Osirion. So, the Osirion was not entirely unknown before the first modern explorers arrived. The ancient Greeks had been there. In 25 BC, the Greek writer Strabo visited Abydos and described what he saw in terms that would fascinate archaeologists for centuries until the site would one day be rediscovered. Above this city lies Abydos. Where is the Memnonium, a royal building which is a remarkable structure built of solid stone in the same workmanship as that which I described to the labyrinth, though not multiplex, and also a fountain that lies at a great depth so that one descends to it down vaulted galleries made of monoliths of surprising size and workmanship. A fountain at great depth, vaulted galleries of enormous monoliths of surprising size and workmanship. Strabo had no real framework to fully explain what he'd seen, because nothing in the Greco-Roman world had ever been built at this kind of scale using stones of this size. He simply described it in the way that a traveler would in ancient times, with wonder and the honest admission that it was comparable to nothing else that he'd seen in Egypt. And he was right. The only structure similar in size and scale and construction to the Osirion is the Khafra Valley Temple standing next to the Sphinx at Giza. But in ancient times, the Valley Temple was buried by sand and rubble, so Strabo wouldn't have been able to visit it. And so, for the next 1900 years, Strabo's well, as the Osirion would come to be called, lay buried under 40 feet of sand and rubble, just waiting for someone to come back down. So, like many great discoveries and explorations, there were no headlines written about the initial discovery of the Osirion. In fact, for years, nobody was even sure where it was. It had been undiscovered for so long that many wondered if it even really existed. The sand of the Egyptian desert is very good at burying and hiding ancient places, and in the case of the Osirion, it had been buried so completely that not even the local workers were quite certain that anything was down there at all. It was in 1902 that one of the greatest archaeologists of the modern era, a man whose name would come to define scientific excavation in Egypt, noticed something strange behind the temple of Seti I, a long, slight depression in the desert surface, a hollow area that shouldn't have been there. His name was Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie. Petrie was, by this point, already a legend in Egyptian archaeology, famously meticulous, famously blunt, famously willing to sleep in a tomb to keep looters away from his dig sites. He'd spent decades in Egypt revolutionizing the science of excavation at a time when most archaeologists were still treasure hunters with a better vocabulary. By 1902, at 50 years old, there wasn't a square mile of important Egyptian soil he hadn't walked. And yet, even he wasn't quite sure what that depression behind Seti I's temple would represent. He had a hunch though, and he knew exactly who to send down into those mysterious Egyptian sands to find out. The second explorer of the Osirion is a name that very few people outside of Egyptology have ever heard of, Margaret Murray. Margaret was born in Calcutta in 1863. And had initially trained as a nurse before pivoting to Egyptology, studying under Petrie at University College of London and becoming the first full-time female lecturer in the field. By the time she arrived at Abydos in 1902, she had already published academic articles on Egyptian hieroglyphs and had developed a reputation for being exceptionally skilled at reading inscriptions under difficult field conditions. Petrie trusted her enough to put her in charge of investigating the depression. And what followed was one of the most physically demanding excavations in the history of Egyptian archaeology. The Osirion was buried under approximately 40 feet of loose sand and formed almost perfectly vertical walls around the structure, meaning the workers had to essentially cut their way straight down like they were mining a shaft rather than digging an archaeological trench. And every time they cleared a section, the desert wind would silt back up and throw sand down into the ancient structure. As Murray herself recounted in her 1904 report, 2 days of high winds once buried an entire cleared section back up to roof level in a single night. She says, "I was able to copy only a very small portion of the inscriptions, for though we cleared the passage to the floor, 2 days of high wind silted it up to the level of the roof." Which is just crazy. There are so many ancient sites that were known in Egypt just 120 years ago that once they were done excavating over the course of the next decade or so, the wind would just completely bury the site. And there are sites even out at Giza that today we know that they do exist, but we don't know where exactly on the Giza plateau they exist. They cleared the Great Central Hall first, and what they found inside defied everything that the team expected. The architecture was absolutely massive, something unlike anything else known to have been built during the New Kingdom. 10 monolithic rose granite columns, each 4 meters high, cut from single blocks of Aswan granite hauled from some 120 miles away. The roof lintels, the enormous horizontal blocks spanning the gaps between the columns, each weighing anywhere from 60 to 100 tons. The surrounding walls were made of red sandstone 5 meters thick, with 17 small chambers carved into them, 6 on each of the long sides and 1 at the back. And below the floor level, nearly flush with the water table and therefore the Nile itself, lay a subterranean moat, a channel of water that would have surrounded a central raised platform like a stone island in an underground lake. It was obvious to Murray that this was not a typical Egyptian tomb-like structure. No pharaoh's burial chambers actually looked like this. The style, the colossal scale of the stonework, the absence of any decoration on the walls of the main hall, it all pointed somewhere much older than the New Kingdom. In her landmark 1904 publication, The Osirion at Abydos, Murray laid out her argument carefully. The other hypothesis was that this was the building for the special worship of Osiris and the celebration of the mysteries, and this appears to me to be the true explanation for many reasons. Each reason may not be convincing in itself, but the accumulation of evidence goes to prove the case. There is no tomb, even among the tombs of the kings, that is like it in plan, none having the side chamber leading off the Great Hall. Then again, no tomb has ever been found attached to a temple. This, as far as we can judge, is a kind of extra chapel, a quote-unquote hidden shrine, as the mythological text express it, belonging to the temple. A hidden subterranean chamber built for the mysteries. And these quote-unquote mysteries are actually mentioned repeatedly by Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the mid-5th century BC or around 450 BC, where at least 6 times Herodotus alludes to the fact that he had either been initiated into the Egyptian mysteries or had at least been educated in how the mysteries worked. But by the order of the mysteries, he could never elaborate on or reveal their secrets. This is actually the same dilemma among those who experienced whatever happened within the cult of Eleusis in Greece. It was clearly a deeply profound experience that compelled so many people to not only partake, but also keep the mysteries a secret. But there was a problem back at the Osirion. The excavation was not finished. The resources of the Egyptian research account simply couldn't cover the cost of clearing the entire structure. As Petrie himself wrote in the foreword to Murray's report, the full clearance was, quote, beyond the slight resources of the Egyptian research account. And he expressed the sincere hope that the Egyptian Department of Antiquities would step in to finish the job. But they didn't, not for another decade at least. So the Osirion was recovered by sand and left waiting again. In 1913, Swiss archaeologist Edouard Neuville arrived at Abydos under the auspices of the Egyptian Exploration Fund to do what Petrie and Murray had not been able to finish: fully excavate and document the Osirion. Neuville was a formidable scholar, a specialist in Egyptian religious texts and a veteran of excavations across the Nile Valley, and his 1914 report, published in the annual report of the Smithsonian Institution, contains one of the most striking passages in the history of Egyptian exploration. After clearing the main passages and finally confirming the identity of the structure, he wrote, "There is no longer any doubt then that we have discovered what Strabo calls the well or the fountain of Abydos. He spoke of it as being near the temple at a great depth and remarkable for some corridors whose ceiling were formed of enormous monolithic blocks. That is exactly what we have found. Strabo's well. After 1,900 years, somebody had finally found it again." Neuville cleared the entrance shaft, the sloping passage, the transversal chamber, and most of the surrounding retaining walls, and the more he cleared, the more troubled he became by the architecture. Because the style was not just unusual for a New Kingdom Egyptian structure, it was consistent with structures that are much, much older. Neuville immediately recognized the parallels between the Osirion and Khafre's Valley Temple at Giza, the stark, undecorated granite structure that sits adjacent to the Great Sphinx. Both used the same heavy monolithic construction technique, drawing massive granite stones from Aswan. And both sites were built to the same colossal scale, and Neuville's conclusion after deeply exploring the Osirion was clear and controversial. We have as yet no certain indications of the date of the construction, but the style, the size of the materials, the complete absence of all ornamentation all indicate very great antiquity. Up to present time, what is called the Temple of the Sphinx at Giza has always been considered one of the most ancient edifices in Egypt. It is contemporaneous with the Pyramid of Khafre, which to us would be Khafre. The reservoir of Abydos, being of similar composition but of much larger materials, is of still more archaic character, and I would not be surprised if this were the most ancient structure in Egypt. The most ancient structure in Egypt. Older than the Valley Temple and older than the Great Pyramids. Neuville wasn't speculating wildly, he was following the evidence in the stones themselves. Cartouches of Seti I have been found on certain architectural elements, which technically assign the structure to his 19th dynasty reign around 1290 BC, but Neuville and later Petrie, who was also willing to entertain the possibility, believe that Seti I may have built over and incorporated this even older early dynastic or perhaps even pre-dynastic structure. They believe that the core of the Osirion may have belonged to a time before the pharaohs. And this was one of the most controversial ideas published in Egypt at the time. And like all great controversial ideas, it was resisted fiercely and would not be fully reckoned with for decades to come. The definitive excavation of the Osirion was carried out between 1925 and 1930 by Dutch-British archaeologist Henry Frankfurt, working for the Egypt Exploration Society. Frankfurt was 28 years old when he began the work, and over the 5 seasons he spent at Abydos, he produced what remains to this day the most comprehensive archaeological record of the monument in existence, the 2-volume cenotaph of Seti I at Abydos, published in 1933. Frankfurt's excavation was the most technically complete of the 4. He fully cleared all 17 chambers, mapped every architectural element, documented every inscription, and traced the structural connection between the Osirion and the Temple of Seti I, which sat above it. His work settled several key questions. The cartouches of Seti I did appear on multiple architectural elements, including within the central hall of the Osirion, evidence that confirms Seti's involvement in the monument's construction or renovation, which could have happened more than 1,000 years later. The passages leading from the temple down into the Osirion formed a deliberate planned axis, showing that whoever designed the complex intended the 2 structures to function together. But again, the question here is this construction contemporaneous with the original core of the Osirion, or was it added later by Seti I? But Frankfurt also documented what made the Osirion so deeply strange. The entrance passage alone was over 420 feet long, more than a football field, sloping downward into the earth at a gentle angle until it reached the central hall, which sat nearly 25 feet below the level of Seti I's temple. The central hall was essentially subterranean. Its floor hovered just above the water table, meaning the surrounding moat would have been perpetually partially filled with water, with the central stone island rising above the surface like a landmass in some kind of primordial sea. And this imagery was of course not accidental. The ancient Egyptians believed that creation itself had begun with a primordial mound rising from the waters of chaos. The Osirion may have been a physical representation of that very moment taking place in a time before time. The first land, the first light, the tomb, and the rebirth of Osiris played out in stone and water, deep within the earth beneath the holiest city in all of Egypt, leading the initiated deeper and deeper into the monument, as if the passage itself was the journey of the soul through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Frankfurt concluded that the Osirion was a cenotaph, a symbolic and empty tomb built for the performing of the mysteries. It was a place where the death and resurrection of the god Osiris could be ritually enacted, where the waters of the Nile could flood the central chamber and recede in imitation of Osiris' own cycle of death and rebirth. In Frankfurt's reading, this was not just a building, it was a machine for performing the oldest religious myth in Egyptian history. The first explorers of the Osirion, Petrie, Murray, Neville, and Frankfurt, each contributed a piece of what remains even today a very incomplete picture. We know that the Osirion exists. We know it's made up of megalithic red granite blocks dragged over 100 miles from Aswan. We know it contained the waters of the Nile in its deepest chambers, and that those who were initiated into the Egyptian mysteries descended into the Osirion for centuries. We know that Seti I claimed it or repaired it, and we know that Strabo explored it some 2,000 years ago and couldn't believe what he'd seen. But what we don't know is deeper and more interesting. We still don't definitively know or understand how old the core of that structure really is. We don't know whether Seti I built it from scratch or inherited it and expanded something that had already existed for over 1,000 years by then. We don't know why it's one of the only 2 known structures in all of Egypt built from monolithic rose granite in this exact style, or why the only other similar structure sits right next to the Great Sphinx hundreds of miles away. We don't know what ceremonies took place in the Osirion's 17 chambers, or what the water that once filled the moat was believed to carry or symbolize. And even more mysteriously, we have no idea what's beneath the water. It's very likely that the secrets of the Osirion are sitting beneath those dark waters, just waiting for the next explorers to finally descend down and find them. I'm Luke Caverns, thank you for joining me, and like and subscribe for more stories of exploration on the edges of the world.